What would you do if the one thing that destroyed your life turned out to be sitting in a junkyard, waiting for you to find it? Ryan Carter paid his last $900 for a car that everyone said was dead, a rusted, gutted Aston Martin that experts laughed at, that a CEO mocked in front of a crowd, that not a single person on earth believed was worth saving. They were wrong, because buried inside that forgotten machine was the truth that powerful men had spent years trying to erase, including the truth about him. This is the story of a janitor, a ghost of a car, and the moment everything changed. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the very end. You will not regret it. The auction lot smelled like rust and diesel and old rain. It was the kind of smell that settled into your clothes and stayed there. The kind you noticed when you were driving home later and wondered why everything felt heavier than it should. 50, maybe 60 people had shown up that Tuesday morning in November, stamping their feet against the cold, clutching numbered paddles and paper cups of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. Most of them were dealers. A few were collectors with more money than patience. Some were just curious, the type who showed up to liquidation auctions the same way other people rubbernecked at traffic accidents, drawn by the vague hope of witnessing something spectacular fall apart. The lot itself was a gravel field on the edge of Millhaven's industrial district, bordered on three sides by chain-link fence and on the fourth by the gray concrete wall of what used to be a manufacturing plant. The plant had been shuttered for 11 years. Nobody talked about why. In Millhaven, there were a lot of things nobody talked about. Ryan Carter arrived at 7:43 in the morning, 17 minutes before the auction opened. He drove a 2004 Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper and a passenger seat permanently reclined because the adjustment lever had snapped off 2 winters ago. The car ran fine. He'd fixed the timing belt himself using a YouTube tutorial and a borrowed socket set, working in the parking lot of his apartment complex on a Saturday afternoon while his daughter, Maya, sat on the curb eating crackers and handing him tools she couldn't name but had learned to identify by shape. The long flat one, she'd say. Or the one that looks like a dinosaur tooth. She was 6. She was the best assistant he'd ever had. Ryan parked along the fence line and sat in the Civic for a moment before getting out, looking at the auction lot through the windshield. He'd been awake since 4. Not because of anxiety, exactly. More like the low-grade alertness of a man who had learned the hard way that sleep was a luxury that life could revoke without warning. He'd made Maya's lunch the night before, packed her backpack, laid out her clothes on the chair beside her bed. His neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, would walk her to school at 8:15. Ryan had already called to confirm twice. He got out of the car, zipped his jacket against the wind, and walked toward the lot. He was a tall man, lean in the way that suggested he ate regularly, but not abundantly. His hands were clean. He was careful about that, meticulous even, but his knuckles carried the permanent off-color of someone who worked with them often. He had a face that people described afterward, if they described it at all, as quiet. Not handsome in any obvious way, not remarkable. The kind of face that belonged to someone standing behind you in line at a grocery store. The kind you forgot. He'd spent a long time learning to be forgettable. The Hartwell Auction Company had been contracted to liquidate the physical assets of Vandermeer Prestige Automotive, a mid-sized luxury dealership that had gone bankrupt the previous spring. Most of the inventory had already been moved, clean, sellable cars absorbed by other dealerships within weeks of the filing. What remained were the problem children, vehicles with title disputes, significant damage histories, or restoration costs that outweighed their market value on paper. The Aston Martin was in the back row. Ryan had known it would be here. He'd done his homework, 3 weeks of it, evenings after Maya went to sleep, cross-referencing Vandermeer's bankruptcy filings with archived auction manifests and a motor vehicle records database he accessed through a free trial account he'd created specifically for this purpose. The Aston Martin DB7, chassis number ending in 4471, had appeared and disappeared from various auction records over the past 4 years, like a stone skipping across water. Every time it surfaced, something happened. The sale fell through, the auction was delayed, the listing vanished. Ryan had noticed the pattern before he'd noticed anything else about the car. He'd noticed the pattern because he'd spent years learning what buried things looked like. When he found the car in the back row, he stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. It was bad. He'd known it would be bad, but seeing it in person was different from seeing it in blurry photographs on a liquidation website. The bodywork was savaged, not just rust, but structural damage, panels hammered in from multiple angles, the front fascia essentially gone. The hood had been removed at some point and never replaced. The interior was gutted, foam exposed, wiring pulled out in ragged handfuls. Someone had taken a grinder to sections of the frame for reasons Ryan couldn't immediately understand. The engine bay was open to the sky and full of dead leaves. But Ryan wasn't looking at the damage. He was looking at the engine block. He crouched down in the gravel, ignoring the cold, and studied it. He'd brought a small flashlight, a habit from years ago, from a different life, and he clicked it on now, directing the beam carefully, slowly, the way a surgeon moves before the first incision. He wasn't rushed. He looked for a long time. "You planning to camp out there?" He glanced up. A heavy-set man in a Carhartt jacket was watching him with the specific brand of amusement people reserve for witnessing foolishness they find entertaining. The man had a dealer's paddle tucked under one arm and the confident stance of someone who'd been buying and selling cars for 20 years. "Just looking," Ryan said. "At what?" The man gestured broadly at the wreck. "There's nothing left to look at, friend. That thing's a parts car at best, and most of the parts aren't worth pulling." He shook his head. "It's going for scrap weight, 200, maybe 3. Nobody's touching it otherwise." Ryan stood up. "What do you know about its history?" The man shrugged. "Vandermeer took it in on consignment about 5 years back from some private collector who didn't know what they had, already in rough shape. They warehoused it, forgot about it, and here we are." He paused, looking at Ryan with mild curiosity. "Why? You're not actually thinking about bidding, are you?" "Maybe." The man laughed, not unkindly, but not gently either. "Son, I've been in this business since before you were probably driving. That car is dead. Whatever it was, it isn't anymore." Ryan looked at the Aston Martin again. "Yeah," he said, people keep saying that." So the auction started at 8 sharp. 32 vehicles moved through the block in the first hour and a half, brisk, efficient, the auctioneer's voice rising and falling in its practiced rhythm like something between a chant and a pressure system. Ryan stood near the back of the crowd, watching, waiting. He had a paddle. He'd registered with the cashier before the opening, paid his deposit, received his number, 47. He watched other bidders the way he watched most things, quietly, with patience that other people sometimes mistook for inattention. He noted who was here for flips, who was here for collections, who was here because they'd gotten a tip and were trying to look like they hadn't. The cold had thinned the crowd by the time the bidding reached the back rows. People had gotten their wins or their defeats and drifted back to warm vehicles or gone to find coffee. The Aston Martin was item 31. When the auctioneer called it, Ryan moved forward through the remaining crowd to see better. The car had been rolled out on a wheeled dolly by 2 workers who handled it with the indifference of men moving furniture between apartments. The auctioneer gave the lot number, the chassis information, the condition rating, which was the lowest possible designation, a code that essentially meant we're not responsible for whatever this is, and opened the bidding at $200. There was brief, scattered interest. A few paddles went up, hesitantly, feeling out the room. The bidding crawled to 400, then stalled. Ryan raised his paddle. He bid $900. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it had a quality to it, a sudden sharpening of attention, the way a room changes when someone does something unexpected. A few heads turned. The auctioneer paused a half-beat longer than usual. $900, bidder 47. "Do I hear 1,000? Nobody moved. "Going once? Going twice." The gavel came down. "Sold to bidder 47. The man in the Carhartt jacket found Ryan afterward at the cashier's table, watching him write the check with an expression somewhere between disbelief and pity. "900, he said. "For that." "For that," Ryan agreed. "Man." The dealer shook his head slowly. "I hope you know something I don't." Ryan capped his pen and folded his receipt carefully. "I usually do," he said, and he said it without arrogance, just matter-of-factly, the way you'd state that it was raining outside. He didn't say it to the dealer exactly. He was talking to himself. Sophia Bennett had been at the auction for 40 minutes before Ryan bid on the Aston Martin, and she had been bored for 38 of them. She'd come because her head of procurement, Gerald Osei, had called her at 7 that morning with information that one of the items in the Vandermeer liquidation might be worth her attention. A 1970 Dino Ferrari with provenance documentation that could make it interesting for the Bennett Group's private collection. The Ferrari had sold in the first 20 minutes for significantly less than it was worth, snapped up by a collector who clearly knew exactly what he was looking at, which meant Gerald's tip had been, as tips often were, slightly too late to be useful. So Sophia had stayed, which was unusual for her. She was not a woman who stayed in places after her reason for being there had expired. Her PA would have described her schedule as aggressive. Her board of directors would have used the word relentless. A profile in Automotive Industry Weekly had called her the most focused CEO in the luxury sector, which she'd read twice and then set aside because focus was a tool, not a personality, and she had never confused the two. She was 30 years old. She'd taken over her father's struggling import company at 24 after he had a stroke, and had spent the 6 years since rebuilding it into something nobody had predicted she could build. The Bennett Group now held distribution rights for 4 European luxury marques in the North American market, and had just closed a partnership agreement that would expand into Southeast Asia by the following year. She had done this through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and a genuine mechanical intuition that surprised people who expected her to be purely a finance mind. She understood cars the way some people understood music, not just technically, but intuitively. She could hear a misfire in an idle the way a musician hears a flat note, which was why the bid on the Aston Martin caught her attention. She turned to look at the bidder, Pate 47, a tall man in a plain jacket near the back, and the first thing she thought was that he'd made a mistake. The Aston Martin was a disaster, and she knew enough about DB7s to know that even a complete restoration on a sound example was a significant financial undertaking. This example was not sound. This example was, by any reasonable assessment, not an investment. The man, Ryan, though she didn't know his name yet, stood quietly as the gavel came down, folded his receipt with the careful movements of someone accustomed to keeping track of small things, and walked to where the car was being held. She followed, not because she had a reason to, because something about the transaction bothered her, and when things bothered Sophia Bennett, she went toward them rather than away. "Excuse me," she said. Ryan turned. He looked at her with an expression that was neither impressed nor guarded, just attentive, the kind of look that said, "I'm listening without saying anything else." "Are you aware of this vehicle's condition report?" she asked. "Yes." "And you understand that the restoration cost on a DB7 in this state would exceed $40,000 to $60,000, depending on sourcing," he said, "assuming you're restoring it to factory spec." She paused. "That's a significant loss on a $900 investment. That's one way to calculate it." She studied him for a moment. He wasn't being aggressive, wasn't posturing. He was just answering her questions the way you'd answer a stranger's questions, politely, directly, with no particular desire to continue the conversation. "What's the other way?" she asked. "That depends on what you find inside." She looked at the gutted, rusted Aston Martin, then back at him. "You think there's something inside worth finding. I think most people give up on things before they've looked closely enough." It was a simple statement, delivered without any drama. But something about the way he said it, the flatness of it, the absence of performance, made her feel, briefly, like she'd missed something. She didn't like that feeling. She was not accustomed to feeling like she'd missed something. "It's a financial disaster," she said. She said it clearly, loudly enough that the two men standing nearby, the Carhartt dealer and a younger guy who worked for Hartwell, could hear it. She didn't say it to be cruel. She said it because she believed it, and because she had built her entire career on the discipline of calling things what they were. Ryan held her gaze for a moment. "Okay," he said, "just okay. No argument, no defensiveness, no wounded pride." He turned back to the car. She walked away. But she looked back once, she couldn't explain why. And he was already crouched beside the engine bay again, flashlight on, examining something she couldn't see from where she stood. His name was Ryan Carter, and for the past 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days, he had worked as a sanitation and maintenance technician, the formal title on his employee badge, for Hargrove Prestige Automotive, one of the largest luxury automotive distributors on the East Coast. Janitor was what everyone called it. Ryan called it a job. He pushed carts. He swept floors. He cleaned executive bathrooms on the 4th floor of the Hargrove headquarters building and polished the lobby floors and replaced fluorescent tubes in the engineering annex and emptied the wastebasket in the corner of the CFO's office every Tuesday and Thursday. He wore a gray uniform with his name embroidered on the left chest. He moved through the building like furniture moves through a house. Present, necessary, invisible. Nobody at Hargrove knew what he used to be. That was intentional. Ryan had grown up in Mill Haven, the way a lot of kids grew up there, knowing the names of every shortcut between neighborhoods, learning early which blocks to avoid after dark, watching the manufacturing plants close one by one through middle school and high school like stores in a mall going dark. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father had left when Ryan was 9, reappearing periodically for a year or 2 before disappearing again, a pattern that had eventually settled into permanent absence. What Ryan had was engines. It started with a neighbor's lawnmower when he was 12. The thing wouldn't start, and the neighbor was about to throw it away, and Ryan asked if he could try to fix it. Not because anyone had taught him engines. He just looked at the thing and felt like he understood it. The same way some kids look at a math problem and feel the logic of it before they've done any work. He took the mower apart on the driveway, laid out every piece in order on an old sheet, diagnosed a cracked fuel line and a fouled plug, and put it back together. It started on the first pull. From there, it grew. By high school, he was rebuilding engines in the back lot of an auto shop run by a man named Doyle, who didn't ask many questions but knew talent when he saw it, and paid Ryan a fair hourly rate for labor. By the time Ryan graduated, Doyle had offered him a full-time position. Ryan thanked him and went to Crestford Technical College on a scholarship instead. He graduated with honors. He was hired at 22 as a junior engineer at Hargrove Prestige Automotive. He was good at his job, genuinely, uncomplicatedly good, in a way that didn't require any politics or self-promotion to become obvious, the kind of ability that announced itself simply by the quality of the work. His supervisor in the engineering division, a man named Mercer, called him the best instinct I've ever seen in someone under 30. He was promoted twice in 18 months. He was moved into experimental development. He was given access to a project that barely existed on paper. The Meridian Project. It was, at least as Hargrove's executive team described it in the meetings Ryan was allowed to attend, a revolutionary propulsion system for luxury performance vehicles, a hybrid architecture that solved problems the industry had been wrestling with for years, combining combustion efficiency with electric torque delivery in a way that, if it worked, would change what luxury performance meant. The project had been running for 4 years before Ryan joined it. He had been recruited specifically because of his instinct with combustion dynamics, something the project's lead engineer, a man named Doyle Ashford, had recognized immediately. Ryan threw himself into it completely. He was 25 years old. He was unmarried, deeply in debt from student loans, living in a studio apartment and eating cereal for dinner 3 nights a week. He worked 60, 70-hour weeks without complaint. He loved the work with the kind of love that doesn't require anything back. Pure, unreasoning, the way you love something you've been searching for without knowing you were searching. For 2 years, it was the best period of his life. Then the test happened. It was a Wednesday in March. Ryan remembered everything about that day with the granular, unwanted precision of a memory that has been turned over so many times it has worn grooves in you. The test was a controlled performance evaluation of a Meridian prototype installed in a custom chassis, a closed-course run designed to assess the propulsion system under sustained load. Ryan had spent the previous 6 days reviewing the calibration data and had flagged a concern, a thermal management issue in the secondary compressor that he believed could cause cascading failure under extended high-load conditions. He'd written it up. He'd submitted it. He'd brought it up in the pre-test briefing. Ashford had dismissed it. "We're well within tolerances," he'd said. "If you're concerned, document it, but we're proceeding." Ryan had documented it. He'd put his concerns in writing, time-stamped, submitted through the official project management system. 40 minutes into the test run, the prototype failed catastrophically. The secondary compressor overheated exactly as Ryan had predicted, triggering a cascade that destroyed the test vehicle. Nobody was killed, the track safety systems worked, and the driver walked away. But the prototype was gone, and with it the hardware that represented the most advanced iteration of the Meridian system. 2 years of specialized development obliterated. The investigation took 6 weeks. The conclusion, issued in an official report by Hargrove's Internal Review Board, was that the failure had resulted from a calibration error. Specifically, an incorrect parameter entered into the thermal management system during the final pretest configuration. The report identified the engineer responsible for that final configuration. Ryan Carter. The report said he had failed to implement the safety protocols correctly, that his documentation of concerns was, in fact, evidence of awareness of the problem, awareness he had not acted on properly, that his negligence had directly caused the failure. Ryan had read that report sitting at a small conference table with HR on one side and legal on the other, and he had said, "This is wrong." They'd looked at him with the polished, practiced sympathy of people delivering a decision that has already been made. "We understand this is difficult." I'm not saying it's difficult. I'm saying it's factually wrong. The configuration was signed off by Ashford. I have documentation. Mr. Carter, the HR director, a woman named Pollard, had folded her hands on the table. The review board has completed its investigation. The review board. He stopped. He looked at the faces around the table, and he understood, in the particular way that you understand something when every alternative explanation has been closed off, that this had been decided before he sat down. The report wasn't a finding. It was a verdict. He was 27 years old. He lost his job, his reputation, and whatever future he'd been building in one afternoon. 6 months later, Maya's mother, his girlfriend of 3 years, died of complications from an infection that moved faster than anyone expected. He became a father and a single parent simultaneously, in the span of a week, while he was still trying to figure out how to pay rent without the career he no longer had. He did not fall apart. This was not because he was strong in any cinematic, triumphant way. It was because falling apart wasn't an option. Maya needed to eat. Maya needed shoes. Maya needed someone to sit with her when she had nightmares and read her the same 3 picture books repeatedly until she fell asleep. So Ryan stayed functional because the alternative was unthinkable, and he found work where he could find it and eventually landed at Hargrove, the same company that had destroyed him, the one place he knew the building well enough to walk its floors without anyone questioning why he was there. There was something that resembled strategy in that decision. He couldn't quite articulate what he was looking for. But he went there anyway, and he cleaned floors, and he watched, and he waited. Well, he towed the Aston Martin to his garage on a Thursday evening using a borrowed flatbed truck and a series of phone calls to people who owed him small favors. The garage was a single-car unit in the building behind his apartment complex, 12 feet wide, 20 feet deep, with a fluorescent light that buzzed like a dying insect, and a concrete floor that held cold the way concrete floors always do. He'd rented it for $60 a month for the past year. His neighbor Delgado's husband, Carlos, had asked him once what he kept in there, and Ryan had said, "Tools," and Carlos had nodded and not asked again. The night he brought the Aston Martin in, he didn't start working immediately. He stood in the garage doorway with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at the car under the buzzing fluorescent light. And he let himself feel the specific anxiety of having spent $900, 2.5 weeks of take-home pay, on something that might be exactly what everyone said it was. Nothing. He was good at sitting with discomfort. He'd had a lot of practice. After a while, he set down the coffee cup and put on his gloves. The first thing he did was document everything. He photographed the car from every angle, measured key dimensions, created a written inventory of every component present and absent. He did this with the methodical precision of an engineer conducting a forensic analysis, because that was what he was doing. He wasn't restoring the car. Not yet. He was reading it. The bodywork damage was extensive but not random. This was the first thing that struck him as he worked. Random deterioration has a pattern. Rust spreads from the outside in, following water intrusion points, pooling in low spots. Mechanical damage accumulates in predictable areas, but the damage on this car had a different character. Some of it was genuine age. Some of it was deliberate. Specific panels had been stressed in specific ways. The missing interior wasn't just stripped, it had been stripped systematically, leaving the mounting points for specific components intact while removing everything else. Someone had worked on this car, deliberately, with a purpose. He found the first anomaly on the third night. He'd been working on the engine bay, clearing debris, cleaning components, beginning to assess what was actually present versus what merely looked present, when his light caught something on the engine block that made him stop. A partial stamp. Not from the standard Aston Martin production system, which he knew because he'd been cross-referencing the car's available documentation with factory records he'd accessed through a database subscription he'd bought with $30 he couldn't really spare. The standard production stamp should have been in a specific location, with a specific format. This stamp was in the right location, but its format was different, partially ground down. Someone had gone after it with a tool, but not completely. Enough remained that he could see the beginning of a different sequence. He photographed it. He enlarged the photograph on his laptop. He studied it for 2 hours. Then he went inside, made sure Maya was asleep, and sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and began writing down everything he thought he knew about the Meridian Project prototype, the one that had been destroyed in the test, the one that, according to the official investigation, no longer existed. He didn't sleep that night, not because he was afraid exactly. The feeling wasn't fear. It was closer to the feeling you get standing at the edge of something, a cliff, an open door, a conversation that is about to change everything. When you understand that what happens next depends entirely on whether you take the next step. He had spent 4 years telling himself to let it go. Not because it wasn't unjust, he knew what it was, but because survival required a triage of what you spent your energy on. And he'd been in survival mode for long enough that the habit of letting things go had calcified into something that looked almost like acceptance. The stamp on the engine block didn't look like acceptance. It looked like evidence. But by the end of the first week, Ryan had formed a working theory. By the end of the third week, the theory had a substantial scaffold of supporting observations. The chassis dimensions were wrong, not by much, not in any way that would have been visible to a casual observer or even an experienced dealer. But they were wrong in the specific way that a modified vehicle is wrong when someone has tried to make a purpose-built prototype look like a production chassis. The mounting points for the drive system were non-standard, deliberately concealed with aftermarket brackets that were themselves designed to look original if you didn't know what you were looking for. The wiring harness remnants, just scraps, most of it gone, used connector types that weren't introduced to Aston Martin production vehicles until 2 years after this car's listed build date. Someone had built this car around something else. The engine block wasn't a DB7 engine, or rather the outer components were, the pieces that would be visible in any inspection, but the core architecture, the parts that mattered most, were different, modified, advanced. Ryan sat in his garage on a cold Saturday with Maya asleep inside and the wind outside pressing against the thin walls, and he looked at what he'd assembled, and he thought, this is the prototype. Not a prototype. The prototype. The Meridian system. Not destroyed, hidden. Hidden inside a dead car, shipped around the auction circuit for 4 years, sitting in the back row of a liquidation lot because somebody somewhere had run out of ideas for what to do with it and had simply left it in the pipeline to decay. He thought about Ashford, about the report with his name on it, about everything that report had cost him. He thought about Maya. Then he went back to work. The weeks that followed established a rhythm. Days at Hargrove, pushing the cart, changing the fluorescent tubes, being invisible, and nights in the garage, working. Maya adapted to the schedule with the pragmatic flexibility of a 6-year-old who has learned that her father's focused silence is not coldness, but concentration, and who has learned to work around it the way water works around a stone. She did her homework at the small desk he'd set up in the corner of the garage for exactly this purpose. She handed him tools. She asked questions that were sometimes inconvenient and sometimes startling in their precision. "What does the engine do?" she asked one evening, looking at the partially disassembled block on the workbench. Makes things move, Ryan said. Like a heart? He looked at her. Yeah, like a heart. Is this heart broken? He thought about this for a moment. I don't know yet. She considered this with the gravity that 6-year-olds sometimes deploy unexpectedly. But you're trying to fix it. Yeah. Good, she said, and went back to her spelling worksheet. There were hard nights when the money was too tight and the exhaustion was too deep, and the work felt not like purpose, but like delusion, like the kind of thing a broken man does when he can't accept that he's been beaten. Nights when he sat in the garage at 1 a.m, hands greasy, back aching, and looked at the car and thought, what if you're wrong? What if there's nothing here and you spent $900 you didn't have and it's just a dead car and it's always been just a dead car? He didn't have a good answer to that. He had the stamp on the engine block. He had the dimensions. He had the connector types. He had a folder of photographs and notes that grew thicker every week. He had the specific cellular certainty of someone who understands what they're looking at. That had to be enough. He was mopping the 4th-floor executive corridor at Hargrove on a Tuesday afternoon when he heard 2 people talking through the slightly open door of a conference room. He wouldn't have stopped, normally. He didn't stop to listen to conversations. He moved through the building like furniture, present, unnecessary, ignorable. But he heard a name, Meridian. He pushed the mop forward a few feet, then stopped and moved back slowly, without looking toward the door. Can't keep the Meridian files in that classification tier, Gerald. A voice he recognized. Morrison, Senior VP of Corporate Development. If the patent filing goes through before the filing won't go through. Another voice. We've been managing that channel for 3 years. Managing it isn't blocking it. If someone who knows what they're looking at gets access to the technical documentation, nobody has access. The originals are sealed. The digital records were purged. The physical hardware is, a pause, accounted for. Morrison said something Ryan couldn't hear clearly. Then, and Carter? A long silence. Carter's a janitor, the second voice said. He's not a consideration. Ryan stood very still in the corridor, mop handle in both hands, looking at the far wall. He's not a consideration. He moved on down the corridor. He finished the floor. He emptied the wastebaskets. He went home and made dinner for Maya, pasta with butter and parmesan, her favorite, and sat across from her at the kitchen table while she told him about a disagreement she'd had with a friend over whether unicorns would eat grass or only magical flowers. And he listened and offered the opinion that unicorns probably ate whatever was available, being practical creatures, and she received this opinion thoughtfully. After she was asleep, he went to the garage. He worked until 3 a.m. Eat. The engine came back to life on a Saturday in late February, 4 months after the auction. It was not a cinematic moment. There was no swell of music, no triumphant shout. Ryan had been running through a start sequence checklist methodically for 2 hours, correcting 3 separate issues before reaching the point where all systems were nominally ready, and when he finally turned the ignition, a temporary setup, a tangle of leads attached to a portable power supply, what happened was a cough, then a sputter, then a sustained and increasingly stable idle that built in tone from a rough, irregular knock to something smooth and deep and very much alive. He sat back on his heels. The engine ran. He watched the temperature readings on the diagnostic tablet he'd propped against the workbench. He watched the fuel pressure. He listened to the idle, picking apart each sound the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, checking for irregularities. There were a few. The system needed tuning, needed time, needed adjustments he'd already identified and planned for. But it ran. The sound was extraordinary. There was no other word for it. The Meridian architecture had a specific acoustic signature that Ryan had heard once, years ago, during an early test that had gone well, before everything went wrong, and he had not forgotten it. It was the sound of something that should not exist, producing power in a way that conventional understanding said was impossible to achieve this efficiently. He heard that sound now in his 12-foot-wide garage at 11:30 on a Saturday night in February. He sat on the cold concrete floor and put his back against the wall and closed his eyes and just listened. After a while, he reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone and called Mrs. Delgado, who had given him her number for exactly this kind of late-hour situation, and who answered on the second ring with the resigned alertness of a woman who expected unexpected calls. "I need to ask you something," Ryan said. "Go ahead," Mrs. Delgado said. "Can you check on Maya in the morning? I'm going to be in here for a while." A pause. "You okay?" "Yeah," Ryan said. He looked at the engine, running, breathing, impossibly alive. "Yeah, I think I might actually be okay." The engine ran for 47 minutes that first night before Ryan shut it down. Not because something went wrong, because he was tired and methodical and understood that running a system to exhaustion on its first revival was how you created new problems, and he already had enough of those. He documented the idle data, logged the temperature curve, noted 3 items for adjustment on the calibration sheet he'd taped to the wall above the workbench, and then powered down the temporary ignition setup and stood in the sudden silence of the garage for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The sound of metal cooling after heat is one of the most ordinary sounds in the world if you've spent any time around engines. A series of soft, irregular clicks, the material contracting, settling, returning to its resting state. Ryan had heard it thousands of times. Tonight it sounded different. Tonight it sounded like punctuation at the end of something that had taken 4 months and most of what he had left to write. He locked the garage and went upstairs to his apartment. Maya was asleep on her side with one arm hanging off the mattress, fingers grazing the floor, in the specific boneless way that only children and very tired adults can manage. He straightened her blanket without waking her. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment the way he sometimes did. Not out of anxiety, but out of a habit he'd developed in the early months of parenthood when checking that she was breathing had been something he did compulsively before he trusted himself to sleep. She was fine. She was always fine. She was the most resilient person he knew, and she was 6 years old, and that fact contained something so large he couldn't quite look at it directly. He went to bed. He slept 4 hours. He got up and made Maya's breakfast and didn't say anything about the night before, because there was nothing to say yet. The engine running was a beginning, not a conclusion. It was the first sentence of an argument he still had to build. The argument was going to need evidence. He'd known this from the start, known it the way you know the shape of a problem before you know its details, the outline appearing before the content. Running the engine proved it existed. It didn't prove anything about where it had come from, or what had happened to the project it belonged to, or who had made sure it disappeared. For that, he needed the documentation that was buried inside the car just as deliberately as the engine itself. On the 3rd night after the first start, he found it. He'd been working through the interior structure, what remained of it, with the systematic attention he brought to everything. The passenger compartment had been stripped so aggressively that at first glance there was nothing left to find. But Ryan had learned over the past 4 months that whoever had worked on this car was thorough without being perfect. They'd done enough to fool a casual inspection, even a professional one. They hadn't done enough to fool someone who was looking for something specific. The space behind the rear seat bulkhead, in a standard DB7, a mostly structural dead zone, had been reinforced. Not obviously. Not in any way that would register as unusual unless you were measuring and found that the cavity depth didn't match the listed specification by almost 3 centimeters. Ryan had measured it on his 2nd week and noted the discrepancy and moved on, filing it in the back of his mind for later. Later had arrived. He cut through the interior panel carefully, working with a utility knife along seams that were already compromised, and behind the reinforced section he found a waterproof case roughly the size of a hardcover novel, secured to the frame with 2 stainless steel bolts and a strip of industrial adhesive. The case was scratched and dusty but intact. He turned it over in his hands. It had a mechanical combination lock built into the latch. He sat with it for a moment, feeling its weight. Then he put it on the workbench and went to work on the lock. He wasn't a safe cracker. He didn't have any particular skill with combination locks. What he had was patience and a working understanding of how cheap mechanical locks failed, which was, predictably, if you applied light pressure and felt for the binding point in each gate. It took him 40 minutes. The case opened with a sound like a breath being released. Inside, wrapped in a layer of anti-humidity silica packets that had long since stopped absorbing anything useful, were 2 items. The first was a USB drive in a protective sleeve. The second was a folded document, 40 or 50 pages, he estimated, printed on paper that had yellowed at the edges, held together with a binder clip. He unfolded the first page and read the header. Meridian Project, Internal Audit. Phase 3, Review. Confidential. Beneath that, a date. March 15th, 2 weeks before the test that had destroyed his career. And beneath the date, a list of names. Engineers, technicians, supervisors, a record of who had reviewed what, who had signed off on what, who had been present for which procedures. His own name was there. As expected, he'd been on the project. But it was the signature on the final sign-off, the pretest configuration authorization, the document that the official investigation report had implied he had falsified, that made him stop. The signature wasn't his. It was Ashford's. Doyle Ashford, project lead, senior engineer, the man who had dismissed Ryan's concerns in the pre-test briefing and told him they were within tolerances. The man who had sat quietly through 6 weeks of investigation and said nothing while Ryan's name was attached to the conclusion. Ryan stood very still over the workbench for a long time. He'd known, abstractly, that the report was wrong. He'd said so the day they delivered it. He'd believed it in the way you believe things you can't prove, with the hollow certainty of someone who knows the truth but cannot make anyone else know it. Knowing a thing and having documentation of it are two different categories of knowing, and only one of them is useful when powerful people are invested in the other version of events. He had documentation now. He read through the entire document standing at the workbench, not moving except to turn pages. It took him 2 hours. By the end, he had a picture of the Meridian project that was substantially different from the official narrative, a picture in which the test failure had been not only predictable, but in certain internal communications reproduced in the audit, anticipated. Anticipated by people who had reason to want the project to fail at a specific moment, in a specific way, with a specific person holding the technical responsibility. There was a section near the back of the document that he read 3 times. It was a summary of a meeting, informal, off the record, the kind that doesn't appear in official minutes, between Ashford, Morrison, and a name Ryan didn't recognize. Callaway, VP, Strategic Development, listed with a company designation that wasn't Hargrove, an outside entity. The summary described a discussion about the timeline for the Meridian Systems patent filing, the commercial implications of the technology reaching market, and the risks associated with independent verification of Phase 3 results. The summary was clinical in the way that documents produced by careful people trying to say something without quite saying it are clinical, but the meaning was clear enough. Someone outside Hargrove had not wanted the Meridian system to reach market. Someone with enough leverage inside the company to arrange for its most promising development to be buried, its hardware hidden rather than destroyed, because destroyed hardware couldn't be retrieved later if circumstances changed, and its lead field engineer discredited thoroughly enough that nobody would take his account seriously. Ryan closed the document and looked at the USB drive. He plugged it into his laptop. It contained 2 folders. The first held technical schematics, detailed, annotated, the complete developmental record of the Meridian Systems Phase 3 architecture. The second held audio files, 11 of them, each labeled with a date and a set of initials. He put on his headphones and listened to the first one. Ashford's voice, talking to someone whose voice he didn't recognize, discussing calibration targets. Nothing obviously significant. He moved to the 3rd file, then the 5th. The 7th file was 13 minutes long. Ashford's voice again, and Morrison's, and a 3rd voice, flat, precise, with the particular diction of someone accustomed to choosing words as tools. They were talking about Ryan. "Carter's going to figure it out," Ashford's voice said. There was stress in it, the specific stress of a man trying to sound confident in a conversation where he isn't. "He's already flagged the thermal issue. If he pushes it, he won't push it past the test," the 3rd voice said. "You don't know him. He's Mr. Ashford." A pause. "After the test, Carter's documentation will support the finding we need. That's already been arranged." Silence on the recording. Then Morrison. "And the prototype?" "The prototype will be handled separately. It needs to be accessible, not destroyed." "Why not destroyed?" "Because the technology is worth more intact," the 3rd voice said. "We're not in the business of destroying valuable assets. We're in the business of controlling when and how they surface." The recording ended. Ryan sat in his garage at 2 in the morning with his headphones around his neck, looking at the laptop screen, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, exactly. Something colder than anger. The specific temperature of a person who has been waiting 4 years for confirmation and has just received it and now has to figure out what to do with it. He closed the laptop. He locked the case, relocked it, combination reset to a sequence only he knew. He hid it behind a false panel he built in the back of the garage shelf unit over the following 2 evenings, taking his time, doing it right. He copied the USB drive's contents to 3 separate encrypted locations. An external drive he kept at work in the bottom of his maintenance locker, a cloud account he'd created under a name that wasn't his, and a second drive he mailed to a P.O. box he'd rented the previous year in a town 40 minutes away, for reasons he hadn't fully articulated to himself at the time, but which now made complete sense. He had learned from hard experience that evidence disappeared when powerful people wanted it to. He was not going to let this disappear. But he was also not stupid. He knew what happened to people who surfaced this kind of information without preparation, without timing, without an audience large enough to make suppression impractical. He'd watched it happen, not to himself, but to others, in industries where inconvenient truths had the structural lifespan of a paper cup. You needed leverage. You needed visibility. You needed to reach a point where the cost of silencing you exceeded the cost of whatever you were saying. He wasn't there yet. He needed the car to be more than a car. He needed it to be a story. So he went back to work. The weeks after finding the case had a different quality than the weeks before. Before, the work had been driven by theory, by the working hypothesis that something was hidden here, that the pattern of the car's history meant something, that his instinct was telling him something true. Now the work was driven by certainty, which was both easier and heavier. Easier because doubt takes energy, and he'd been spending a lot of energy on doubt. Heavier because certainty about a thing like this carries weight that theory doesn't. He worked on the engine calibration. He sourced components, carefully, using suppliers spread across 3 states, paying cash where possible, being patient when the right part took time to find. He worked on the chassis, addressing the structural damage with the methodical attention of someone who understood that the integrity of the frame was not aesthetic, but mechanical, not about appearances, but about function. He rebuilt the suspension geometry. He addressed the brake system. He was not restoring the car to original spec. He was restoring it to what it actually was, which was something different from any production vehicle, and that required making decisions that a standard restoration wouldn't require. He made those decisions carefully. When he was uncertain, he worked from the schematics on the USB drive, cross-referencing against his own knowledge of the system's architecture. When he was still uncertain, he sat with it, thought it through, and then decided. He was wrong sometimes. He corrected it and moved forward. Maya was present for a lot of this, in the quiet peripheral way she'd established as her version of involvement. She was in 2nd grade now, had moved up in September, came home with a reading level assessment that her teacher described with visible pride, and which Maya accepted with the equanimity of someone who expected to be competent and was not surprised by confirmation. She sat at her corner desk and did her homework, and occasionally made the commentary that 6- and 7-year-olds make when they are watching something they don't entirely understand. "It looks different," she said one evening in March, looking at the car. Several weeks of work had begun to show. The body panels were off, the frame was clean, the engine bay was no longer a nest of dead leaves and corroded metal, but an organized system with visible logic. "It's getting there," Ryan said. "Where is it getting to?" He looked at the car for a moment. He thought about how to answer this in a way that was honest without being complicated. And then he said, "It's getting to where it was supposed to be before someone stopped it." Maya considered this. "That's kind of mean," she said. "Stopping something before it gets to where it's supposed to be." "Yeah," Ryan said. "It is." She nodded, apparently satisfied with this assessment, and went back to her worksheet. There were moments in the long nights when Ryan sat back from the work and looked at where he was and understood, with some clarity, how close to the edge of things he was operating. Not financially, though the money was tight in a way that had become normalized, a chronic condition rather than a crisis. But in terms of what he was doing and what it could cost him. He had evidence that implicated senior executives at one of the largest luxury automotive companies in the country. He had the physical object at the center of the scandal, hidden in a 12-foot garage that he rented for $60 a month. He was a janitor. He was a single father. He had no legal counsel, no institutional backing, no one who knew what he was doing. The isolation of it was something he didn't let himself think about too directly, because it didn't help anything. What helped was the next task on the list. What helped was the sound of Maya breathing in the next room. What helped was the recording of Ashford's voice on the 7th audio file, the third voice saying after the test, "Carter's documentation will support the finding we need," a sentence that had become a kind of fuel he burned when everything else ran low. He thought sometimes about the moment he'd stood at that cashier's table at the auction, writing the check for $900. He thought about how clearly he'd seen, even then, that there was something about the car's history that didn't add up. The way it kept surfacing and disappearing, the way the pattern of its movement through the auction system had the character of something being managed rather than merely neglected. He thought about Sophia Bennett watching him write that check, and the flat certainty in her voice when she said, "It's a financial disaster." And he thought about the way she'd looked back once, at the end, when he was crouched by the engine bay, the look of someone who has dismissed something and is not entirely comfortable with the dismissal. He didn't think about Sophia Bennett much beyond that. She was a detail at the edge of the story, not central to it. She was a person who had seen him for approximately 8 minutes and drawn the same conclusion everyone drew, that he was nobody, doing something pointless, for reasons that didn't bear examining. He was used to that. It had stopped mattering a long time ago. What mattered was the car. By April, the engine was running smoothly enough that he was making incremental performance tests in the parking lot of the industrial complex after midnight when it was empty. Not full performance runs. The car wasn't ready, and the venue wasn't appropriate. And more importantly, he wasn't ready to be seen. The tests were confined and careful, long enough to gather data, short enough to remain unnoticed. He collected every data point and documented it. The numbers were extraordinary. He'd known the Meridian system was advanced. He'd worked on it, had understood the theoretical performance envelope during the development phase. But theory and function are different things, and reading numbers from a system he'd rebuilt himself, in conditions he controlled from a car that had been declared dead and written off and hidden for years, those numbers had a different quality than anything he'd calculated on paper. He sat in the parking lot one night in April with the engine running and the diagnostic tablet in his hands, reading output figures that should not have been achievable with existing commercial architecture. And he thought about all the engineers who were going to see this eventually, the ones who would look at these numbers and not believe them and then look again and have to. He thought about what it would mean for the industry if this technology reached the world. He thought about the patent filing Morrison and Callaway had discussed on the 7th audio file, about controlling when and how things surfaced, about the technology being worth more intact. He turned off the engine and drove home. The video happened by accident, which was the most accurate way to describe it, though not entirely. It was a Thursday night in late April. Ryan was doing a longer test run in the industrial lot, and Mrs. Delgado's teenage grandson, Marco, happened to be passing by on his way home from a friend's place. Marco was 17 and owned a phone with a camera that his parents had gotten him for his birthday, and which he used with the reflexive, constant documentation habit of his generation. He heard the engine from the street, came through the gap in the fence to look, and stood there with his mouth open for about 30 seconds before Ryan noticed him. "What is that?" Marco said. Not a question exactly, more like a response to something that had bypassed the question stage. Ryan looked at him. "It's a car." "That's not a car sound," Marco said. "I've never heard a car make that sound." Ryan considered asking him to leave and then didn't. Marco was 16 steps removed from anyone who would know what they were looking at. And the kid's expression, the pure, unperformed astonishment of someone hearing something genuinely unprecedented, was, for reasons Ryan couldn't entirely articulate, something he wanted to observe. "What does it sound like?" Ryan asked. Marco struggled with this for a moment. "Like," he shook his head, "like a sound that shouldn't come from a car. Like something that should be in a lab or something." Ryan said. Marco had his phone out. Can I... No video. Marco put the phone down. They stood there for a moment, both listening. Is it electric? Marco asked. No. It doesn't sound combustion. It is. How? Ryan looked at him. That's the question, isn't it? Marco left 20 minutes later, after Ryan had parked the car and was covering it with the tarp he kept in the garage. The kid lingered at the fence gap, looking back, the way people look back at things that have rearranged their understanding of something slightly. Ryan didn't think much about it. He was thinking about a bearing issue he'd identified in the secondary drive system and the sourcing problem it created. 2 weeks later, he was in the parking lot again, later than usual, nearly 1 in the morning, and he was so focused on a calibration sequence he was running that he didn't notice Marco was back until the test run was already in progress. Marco had climbed the fence and was standing 40 feet away in the dark, and this time he had his phone out and he was filming. Ryan killed the engine the moment he saw the phone. "Delete it," he said. Marco looked at him. The kid had the specific expression of someone caught in something they knew was wrong but hadn't quite committed to yet. "It's just... Marco." Ryan's voice was flat. "Delete it." A pause. Marco looked at the phone, then at Ryan, then at the car. Then he deleted it. "Okay," he said. "Okay, it's gone." Ryan believed him. He walked the kid to the fence and watched him go. He went home. He didn't sleep well. He should have been more careful. He was operating on too little sleep and too much forward momentum, and he had made an error in judgment by allowing the same person to be present twice. He knew it the next morning, standing at the Hargrove building lobby with his cart, with the particular clarity that mornings sometimes provide about the previous night's decisions. He couldn't undo it. He adjusted for it. He moved the test location. He varied his timing. He became more careful about who might be nearby when he ran the engine. He was 3 weeks from what he estimated would be the car's first full-function demonstration. Not for anyone else, not yet, but for his own documentation, a recorded sequence that would stand as the definitive evidence of what the Meridian system could do. 3 weeks. He just had to be careful for 3 more weeks. He was not careful enough. Marco had a friend named Destiny who ran a car culture account on social media with 43,000 followers. He told her about the sound in the parking lot. Not the detail, just the sound. The way you tell someone about something extraordinary you've experienced without being able to fully convey it, and she'd been dismissive in the way people are when they can't picture what you're describing. So when Marco had filmed those 47 seconds before Ryan told him to delete it, he had not deleted it. He had airdropped it to Destiny first. Destiny posted it on a Thursday morning with the caption, "My friend filmed this at 1 a.m. in an abandoned lot in Millhaven, and nobody can tell me what this engine is. The sound is insane. Someone help identify." By Friday morning, it had 800,000 views. By Saturday afternoon, it had 4 million. Ryan found out on Saturday evening when Mrs. Delgado knocked on his door with her phone in her hand and her grandson behind her looking like a man facing a consequence he had understood was coming and had hoped would somehow not arrive. "Ryan," Mrs. Delgado said carefully, "there's something you should look at." He watched the video. 47 seconds. Dark parking lot. The car visible only as an outline. The sound enormous and precise and unlike anything that had been heard in public before because nothing like it had existed in public before. He watched it twice. He handed the phone back. He looked at Marco. Marco met his eyes and then looked away, which was honest, at least. "I'm sorry," Marco said. "I didn't think it would... I just sent it to..." "I know what you did," Ryan said. He said it quietly, without heat, which seemed to frighten Marco more than anger would have. "Go home." Marco went home. Ryan closed the door. He stood in his kitchen for a while. Maya was at Mrs. Delgado's for the evening. They'd been watching a movie, and the apartment was quiet. 4 million views. He went to the laptop and looked at the comment section of the post. Thousands of comments, and they were running in a direction he had not anticipated. Not dismissal, not mockery, but genuine escalating excitement. People who knew cars, people who knew propulsion systems, people who were just responding to the sound with the animal instinct of recognizing something unprecedented. The top comment, with 42,000 likes, was from an account that belonged to a veteran automotive journalist named Lars Henriksen. It said, "I've covered engines for 22 years. I don't know what that is. Somebody needs to find out." The second highest comment was from an account Ryan didn't recognize. It had been posted 4 hours ago. It said, "That engine belongs to a vehicle in Mill Haven. I have significant resources and would like to discuss acquisition. Please contact me directly." Ryan read that comment twice. He looked at the name on the account, SB_Group Holdings. He didn't know the account, but the initials, SB, landed somewhere in his memory, and it took him a moment to place them. And when he did, he felt the first genuine unease he'd felt since finding the case. Sophia Bennett, Bennett Group Holdings, the CEO from the auction, the woman who had called it a financial disaster and walked away. He closed the laptop. He sat in the kitchen in the quiet apartment and thought about the thing he'd known was coming since the engine first turned over. The moment when the story he was building would stop being private and start being something else. That moment was here. He was not ready. He was also, he understood with the same flat clarity that had guided him through 4 months of garage work and 4 years of waiting, not going to stop. He opened the laptop again. He looked at the comment from SB_Group Holdings. He looked at the number, 4 million views and climbing, journalists beginning to post follow-up threads, 3 separate automotive forums already hosting active discussions trying to identify the sound. He thought about the recording on the 7th audio file. We're in the business of controlling when and how they surface. Then he thought, not anymore, you aren't. He pulled up the video again and watched it once more. The dark parking lot, the outline of the car, the sound that had never been heard before. And he thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. The auction in November, the stamp on the engine block, the document behind the bulkhead, Maya handing him tools she couldn't name, asking whether the heart was broken. He hadn't answered that question yet. He was starting to think maybe he finally could. The number hit 12 million by Sunday morning. Ryan knew this because he'd stopped sleeping properly again. The same 4 hours and done pattern from the early garage months, except now the wakefulness had a different quality. Before, it had been the focused alertness of someone working towards something. Now it had the jagged edge of someone who had set something in motion and could no longer control its speed. He sat at his kitchen table at 5:30 Sunday morning with coffee he didn't taste, laptop open, watching the view counter on Destiny's post climb in real time. 12,300,000, 12,340. The comments were coming in faster than any human being could read them. Automotive journalists, engineers, enthusiasts, people who simply liked the sound and didn't know why, all of them pointing at the same 47 seconds of dark parking lot footage and asking the same question in different ways. What is that? Maya appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:15, hair flattened on one side, wearing the oversized t-shirt she used as pajamas. "You didn't sleep," she said. It wasn't a question. She had, over 7 years of watching her father, developed an accurate diagnostic sense for his sleep patterns. "I slept," Ryan said. She looked at him with an expression that communicated precisely what she thought of this answer. She went to the cabinet and got out the cereal herself, poured it herself, got the milk herself, a routine she'd been executing independently for 2 years, and sat across from him at the table. "Is it about the car?" she asked. He looked at her. "Why would it be about the car?" "Because that's what you think about when you don't sleep." She ate a spoonful of cereal. "Is it working?" "Yeah," he said. "It's working." "So that's good." "It's complicated." Maya considered this. "Things that work are usually good," she said, with the particular confidence of someone who has not yet accumulated enough experience to find this logic flawed. Ryan almost smiled. "Yeah," he said, "usually." He dropped her at school at 7:50 and drove to the garage instead of to Hargrove. He called in sick for the first time in 8 months. A distinction he was aware of, because calling in sick when you almost never called in sick was the kind of thing supervisors remembered. He'd deal with that later. Right now, he needed 2 uninterrupted hours to think through what the video meant for the timeline he'd been working from. The timeline, as he'd planned it, had gone roughly like this: finish the restoration, achieve full demonstrated performance, Arrange documentation carefully, identify the right moment and the right audience to surface everything simultaneously. A controlled release. Evidence and car together, presented in a context where suppression would be impractical. The video had broken the timeline in half. The car wasn't finished. The evidence was secure but hadn't been presented to anyone. And 12 million people had already heard the engine, which meant that the people at Hargrove who knew what that sound meant had also heard it. He didn't know how long it would take them to connect a viral video of an unidentified engine in Mill Haven to a missing prototype and a disgraced engineer who happened to be on their janitorial staff. He suspected he had less time than he wanted. He stood in the garage and looked at the car and made a list in his head of what was finished and what wasn't. The engine was done, calibration complete, performance verified, running cleaner than it had any right to run given the restoration conditions. The chassis and suspension were done. The brake system was done. The electrical system was 90% bussing. There were 3 remaining issues he'd identified and planned to address over the following 2 weeks, but they were functional issues, not safety ones. The body was the problem. The exterior was still incomplete. Panels partially refitted, the front fascia rebuilt but not finished, the paint situation not addressed at all because paint had been the last priority on a list that was ordered by function first and appearance last. The car ran. It was not beautiful. He had perhaps 10 days before the attention generated by the video reached a critical temperature. 10 days before journalists started showing up in Mill Haven looking for the source of the sound, before someone at Hargrove made a call he didn't want them to make, before the comment from SB_Group Holdings became a phone call instead of a social media post. He went to work. The call from Sophia Bennett came on Tuesday. He didn't know it was her at first. The number was a corporate line, and when he picked up during his lunch break, sitting in his car in the Hargrove parking lot eating a sandwich he'd made that morning, the voice on the other end belonged to an assistant who identified herself as Priya and asked whether she was speaking with Ryan Carter. "Depends on who's asking," Ryan said. A brief pause that conveyed professional patience. "Ms. Sophia Bennett of the Bennett Group would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience, Mr. Carter." He ate the rest of his sandwich for a moment without answering. "About what?" "Miss Tim, Bennett would prefer to explain that herself. She's available this afternoon or tomorrow morning." He thought about the comment on Destiny's post, thought about the 47 seconds of footage and what Sophia Bennett, who knew cars the way she'd demonstrated at the auction, would have heard in them. "Tomorrow morning," he said. 8 o'clock. Tell her to call this number." "Of course. Can I confirm?" "She'll know what it's about," Ryan said, and hung up. He sat in the parking lot and finished his sandwich and thought about what it meant that Sophia Bennett was calling him. She was, by any assessment, a significant player in the luxury automotive space. She had resources and reach, and based on everything he'd read about her since the auction, he'd done his research the same way he researched everything. A reputation for both genuine mechanical intelligence and a ruthlessness that wasn't cruelty but was real. She did not waste time. She did not call janitors. She was calling because she'd heard the engine, and she knew what she'd heard, and she wanted to know more. The question was what Ryan wanted her to know, and when. He went back inside and pushed his cart down the 4th-floor corridor and thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. Sophia called at exactly 8 o'clock Wednesday morning. Ryan was in the garage early, having already been awake for 2 hours. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Carter." Her voice was exactly as he remembered it from the auction. Precise, not unfriendly, but with the economy of someone who found pleasantries mildly inefficient. "Thank you for taking my call." "Ms. Bennett." A brief silence. He waited. "I saw the video," she said. "I assume you know which one." "I know which one." "That engine," she said, and then stopped. And he heard in the pause the specific difficulty of a person who understands something very well, trying to find language adequate to it. "I've been in this industry for 6 years. I've consulted on development projects with 4 different manufacturers. I've never heard an engine with that acoustic profile, not even close." "Okay," Ryan said. "I want to know what it is." "I know you do." Another pause. Shorter this time, with a different quality. The slight recalibration of someone who expected a different conversational posture. "The comment I left on the post, I saw it." My offer is genuine. If you're looking for acquisition, I'm not. Silence. Then what are you looking for? She asked. Direct. Not aggressive, just direct. Ryan looked at the car, at the incomplete front fascia and the body panels that still needed finishing and the engine sitting in the bay like a contained argument. I'm not sure I'm looking for anything from you specifically, Ms. Bennett. You left a comment on a viral video. I appreciate the interest. Mr. Carter. Something shifted slightly in her voice. I was at the Vandermeer auction in November. I remember you. I remember you too. The silence this time was longer. I called it a financial disaster, she said. You did. She didn't apologize. He hadn't expected her to. Not yet, and maybe not at all. What she said was, I'd like to understand what I missed. Ryan thought about this for a moment. He thought about what she could offer and what she could complicate and how much he could afford to trust someone he'd met for 8 minutes at an auction. He thought about the 10-day timeline and the journalists and the comment from Morrison he'd overheard in the 4th-floor corridor. Come to Millhaven, he said. Friday. I'll text you an address. Another pause. Just like that? Just like that. But Miss Bennett, you come alone. No team, no cameras, no acquisition language. You come because you want to understand what you missed. That's the only reason I'm interested in the conversation. A brief silence that felt like assessment. Friday, she said. What time? 7 in the morning. He heard something that might have been the beginning of a protest about the hour, and then she said, I'll be there. She was there at 6:58, which told him something about her. She arrived in a dark blue sedan she was driving herself. No driver, which he'd half expected her to ignore, and parked along the fence line the same way he'd parked his Civic at the auction. She was wearing dark pants and a jacket that was clearly expensive but not showy, and she carried a coffee in one hand and nothing else. No bag, no folder, no assistant hovering. Ryan was standing in the garage doorway. She walked up and looked at him the way she'd looked at him at the auction, the direct, assessing look of someone whose first instinct is evaluation. Then she looked past him at the car. She stopped walking. The Aston Martin was, by this point, substantially more present than it had been at the auction. The body panels were refitted. The chassis was clean. The engine bay was organized with the precise logic of engineered intent. The car still wasn't beautiful. The paint hadn't been touched, and there were visible repairs in the bodywork that no amount of mechanical excellence could fully conceal. But it was coherent. It looked like what it was, something that had been dead and had been brought back. And the bringing back had been done by someone who understood it at a fundamental level. Sophia stood outside the garage and looked at it for a full 30 seconds without saying anything. Can I go closer? She asked. Go ahead. She walked to the engine bay first, which he'd expected. She looked at the engine for a long time. She didn't touch anything, which he appreciated. People who knew cars knew not to touch things without permission. She looked at specific elements with the focused attention of someone constructing a mental schematic. The compressor architecture, she said, almost to herself. Yeah. That's not production. That's not aftermarket. She looked at him. This is experimental. Yes. She straightened up. She looked at the full car again. Where did you find this? I bought it, Ryan said, at the Vandermeer liquidation. Something moved across her face, the specific expression of a person restructuring a conclusion. This is what you paid $900 for. This is what I paid $900 for. She looked at the car, then at him, then back at the car. I called it a financial disaster. You did. I was wrong. He nodded, just slightly. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without embellishment. No extended apology, no performance of contrition, just the plain statement of a factual correction, issued by someone who treated being wrong as a data point rather than a catastrophe. He found he respected that. Come inside, he said. I'll make coffee. They sat at the small folding table he kept in the corner of the garage for paperwork, with 2 mugs of coffee from the thermos he'd brought from the apartment. It was cold enough in the garage that the steam was visible. Sophia wrapped both hands around her mug and didn't seem bothered by the temperature, which also told him something. Tell me about the engine, she said. He looked at her. Tell me why you want to know. She held his gaze. Because I heard 47 seconds of it on a social media post, and I haven't thought about much else since. Because in 6 years of working in this industry, I've never encountered a propulsion architecture that sounds like that, and I know enough to know that's significant. She paused. And because I've done some research since Tuesday, and I think there's more to this car than the car. Ryan was quiet for a moment. What kind of research? The kind you do when something doesn't add up, she said. I have contacts at 3 different manufacturers, a patent attorney on retainer, and an engineer who consults for me who used to work for... She stopped, looked at him carefully. He used to work for Hargrove, in the experimental division. The air in the garage was very still. Who? Ryan said. His name is Vance, Daniel Vance. He was on a development project there 6, 7 years ago. She watched Ryan's face. You know that name. Vance was on the Meridian project. Ryan said it quietly, not breaking her gaze. He left 8 months before the test. The word landed between them like something dropped. Sophia set her mug down slowly. The Meridian project, she repeated. That's what this engine is, Ryan said. The Meridian prototype. The one the official investigation said was destroyed. She was quiet for a long time. Not the silence of someone at a loss, but the silence of someone processing a structural shift in a large amount of information simultaneously. Ryan watched her do it and waited. The investigation that found the test failure was caused by me, Ryan said. Ryan Carter. Lead field engineer, calibration division, negligent failure to implement safety protocols. He said it the way you say something you've said 1,000 times in your own head, flatly, with the particular lack of inflection that means the opposite of indifference. Except I didn't fail to implement them. I flagged the problem in writing 6 days before the test. The sign-off on the final configuration was Ashford's, not mine, and the decision to proceed knowing the failure risk... He stopped. I have the documentation. Sophia looked at him steadily. What kind of documentation? The kind that was hidden in this car. She absorbed this. That's why the car was never destroyed. The technology was worth more intact, Ryan said. That's a quote. Direct quote from a recording I found in the car. A recording of who? Ashford. Morrison. Senior VP of Corporate Development at Hargrove. And someone named Calloway, who I've been trying to identify. Something changed in Sophia's expression at that name. A small thing. A very slight stillaning. But Ryan caught it because he was watching carefully. You know that name, he said. She looked at him. Then she picked up her coffee mug again, which was something to do with her hands, and she said, Calloway is, or was, VP of Strategic Development at Meridian Capital Group. They're a private investment arm that holds partial stake in 4 major automotive manufacturers, including Hargrove. Ryan sat with this. Meridian Capital Group. The irony of the name is not lost on me, Sophia said, and her voice was dry, but her eyes weren't. They've been in the industry for about 12 years. They have a pattern of acquiring partial stakes in companies with promising development projects and then managing the timeline of those projects, slowing them down, redirecting them. There have been rumors for years, nothing provable. Until now. She met his gaze. If your documentation is what you say it is, yes. Until now. Ryan leaned back in his chair. Outside, the morning had lightened to the gray-white of a cold spring day. He could hear traffic beginning to build on the main road 2 blocks over. Normal sounds. Normal morning. Nothing about this morning was normal. I have to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. Why are you here? Really? You're the CEO of a significant company. You have a legal team and a PR team and an engineering team. You heard 47 seconds of engine audio and left a comment on a social media post and called me 2 days later. He looked at her directly. Why? She was quiet for a moment. It was a different kind of quiet than the processing silence from earlier. More personal, less efficient. Because I dismissed you, she said finally, at the auction. You were buying something I had already decided was worthless, and I said so, publicly, in front of other people. And you just... She stopped. You didn't argue. You didn't defend yourself. You said okay, and went back to looking at the engine. She looked at her coffee. I've been in a lot of rooms with a lot of people who were wrong about something, and most of them argue. The ones who don't argue are usually either resigned or certain, and you weren't resigned. No, Ryan said, I wasn't. I've been thinking about that for 5 months, she said. And then I heard the engine. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. There was nothing soft about the exchange. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was two people at a table assessing each other with the seriousness the situation warranted, trying to determine whether trust was possible and how much of it. He had not expected to trust her. He had expected a negotiation, an offer, a transaction. Instead, he was sitting in a cold garage at 7:15 in the morning watching a CEO hold a thermos mug with both hands and tell him something true. He wasn't ready to tell her everything, but he told her enough. He talked for 40 minutes. The outline of the Meridian project, the test, the investigation, the document, and the recordings from the waterproof case. He didn't show her the physical evidence. Not yet. He told her what it contained and why it mattered and what it meant. He watched her listen, which she did with total attention, not interrupting except twice when she needed a factual clarification. When he was done, the garage was fully lit with morning and both their coffees were cold. You've been working on this alone for 4 years, Sophia said. Yes. While working as a janitor at the company that did this to you? Yes. She nodded slowly, looking at the car. And the viral video? That wasn't planned. No. That was a 17-year-old with a phone. Something that was almost a smile crossed her face. How many views now? Last time I checked, 22 million. She exhaled. You don't have much time. I know. If Hargrove hasn't connected the video to you yet, they will in days. Maybe hours. Morrison will. I know, Ryan said again. I've been thinking about the timeline. What's your timeline? He looked at her. What's yours? She picked up her mug, remembered it was cold, set it back down. I have resources you don't, she said. It wasn't arrogant. It was just true. Legal team, media contacts, engineering consultants who can verify the technology independently. A platform. She paused. And I'm outside Hargrove's org chart, which means I'm outside their ability to manage what I do or say. What do you want for that? She looked at him steadily. I told you at the beginning of this conversation, I came because I wanted to understand what I missed. That's not an answer to what I asked. No, she said. It's not. She thought for a moment. I want to be part of whatever this becomes. Not ownership, not control. I'm not trying to acquire the car or the technology. She met his gaze. I want to be in the room when the truth comes out, because I was one of the people who looked at you and decided you were wrong, and I think I owe it to myself to be present when I find out how wrong I was. It was an honest answer, imperfect in its motivations. There was self-interest in there, and probably some image management, and definitely the professional opportunity of being associated with the story. She wasn't pretending those things weren't there, but beneath them, the core of what she'd said felt real. He didn't trust it entirely. He didn't distrust it entirely. He filed it and moved on. I'm going to finish the car, he said. I need 8 more days. After that, I'm making a full documentation of the performance run, recorded, with technical verification data. That's when the story needs to break. He looked at her. Can your engineering consultant run an independent verification? Daniel Vance, yes. He knows this architecture. He worked on the early phases. If you let him look at it, he can certify that it's what you say it is. Not yet, Ryan said. Not until I'm ready. And not until I know more about how much he knows and whose side he's on. Sophia nodded. She didn't argue the caution. What do you need from me right now? Ryan thought for a moment. I need to know if you have any information on Callaway's current position in Meridian Capital Group. I need to know the full ownership structure of the Hargrove stake. And I need to know whether the patent filing for the Meridian system was ever formally submitted or if it's still blocked. She pulled out her phone and made a note. I can have all of that by end of day Monday. Good. He stood up. The conversation was over. Not badly, but completely. They'd reached the end of what this particular meeting needed to accomplish. Sophia stood too. She looked at the car one more time. She looked at it the way she'd looked at it the first time, with genuine attention, not performance. Her eyes moved over the engine bay, the chassis lines, the incomplete exterior. "It's remarkable," she said quietly. "It is," Ryan agreed. "You did this alone." "I had help," he said. "Sort of." He thought about Maya handing him tools she couldn't name. "My daughter helped." Sophia looked at him, and for the first time something in her expression softened. Not dramatically, not sentimentally, just a slight shift, the way light changes when a cloud moves. "How old is she?" "7." She nodded. She walked toward the garage door and then stopped and turned back. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Ryan." She said his name like she was testing whether it fit. "For what it's worth, I don't make a habit of being wrong twice about the same thing." He held her gaze. "Neither do I." She left. He stood in the garage alone with the car and the cooling coffee mugs and the morning light coming through the gap in the garage door. He thought about what he'd told her and what he hadn't, and whether the calibration between those two things was right. He thought about Vance, who'd left the Meridian project 8 months before the test, early enough that his name wasn't in the audit document, early enough to have avoided being directly implicated in anything, but who might know things that filled in gaps? He thought about the way she'd said, "I don't make a habit of being wrong twice." He thought about the timeline. 8 days. He went to work. The next 8 days were the most intense of the restoration, and they contained some of the hardest moments, because intensity without adequate sleep and adequate food and adequate everything else produces errors, and errors in this kind of work produce setbacks, and setbacks eat time you don't have. He made 3 mistakes in the first 4 days, all of them correctable, none of them minor. He corrected them. He adjusted his process and went slower, which paradoxically produced faster results, because a mistake found in real time is manageable, and a mistake found after the fact costs double. Maya watched him more carefully during these days. She'd developed, over the course of the restoration, a kind of passive monitoring. Nothing intrusive, nothing pressuring, just the quiet attention of someone who cares about someone and has learned that direct inquiry doesn't always help. On the 5th day, she said, at dinner, "You're going to finish it." He looked up. "Yeah." "And then what?" He set down his fork. He looked at his daughter, her dark, serious eyes, her cereal at 6 in the morning competence. Her is the heartbroken precision. And he said, "And then we find out if telling the truth is enough." Thought about this. Is it usually enough? "Not always," he said honestly, "but this time?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think we have enough people listening this time." She nodded, as though this were a satisfactory answer, and went back to eating. The car was ready on day 7, 1 day ahead of estimate. He'd pushed for it. Not recklessly, but with the focused pressure of someone who has been building toward a moment and can feel it close. The documentation run was scheduled for Saturday morning, a full performance sequence in an industrial test space he'd arranged through a contact in the engineering community, a man named Torres who asked no questions and charged a fair hourly rate for facility access. The night before, Ryan sat in the garage for a long time after finishing the last checklist item, not working, just sitting. The car was in front of him, complete, not perfect, never going to be perfect, but whole. Everything it had been meant to be, recovered from everything that had been done to it. He thought about the man who'd stood at an auction in November and paid $900 for a dead car, while a CEO watched and called it a disaster. He thought about what that man had known that nobody else in the lot knew, and what it had cost him, and what the cost had been worth. He was still working through the second part of that equation when his phone buzzed. A text from Sophia. It said, "Callaway resigned from Meridian Capital Group 3 weeks ago. No public reason given. Patent filing for Meridian system. Officially withdrawn 4 years ago. But there's a new filing. Different company name, same core architecture. Filed 6 weeks ago." Ryan read the message twice. Then he read the last line again. Same core architecture. Someone wasn't just sitting on the technology. Someone was trying to file it as their own. They'd waited 4 years for the dust to settle, for Ryan Carter, the janitor, to become sufficiently irrelevant, and now they were moving. His phone buzzed again. Sophia, we need to move faster than 8 days. He looked at the car. He typed back, we move tomorrow. He put his phone in his pocket and stood up and turned off the garage light. In the dark, he couldn't see the car, but he could feel its presence. The 1,200 pounds of metal and engineering and evidence, and 4 years of his own stubborn refusal to accept the verdict that had been handed to him. Outside, the city went about its evening, cars passing on the main road, the distant sound of a train, someone's television through a wall. Ryan locked the garage and went upstairs to check on his daughter. Tomorrow was going to change everything. He just needed it to change in the right direction. The documentation run happened at 5:40 in the morning before the city was fully awake. Torres had given Ryan a 4-hour window at the industrial test facility, a private space used primarily by small fabrication companies for equipment trials, with a long straight section of sealed floor and enough clearance to run meaningful performance data. It wasn't a racetrack, it wasn't ideal, but it was controlled, it was private, and Torres had installed the data logging equipment Ryan had specified without asking what it was for, which was the most important quality a venue could have that morning. Ryan had been there since 4:30, running pre-checks. Sophia arrived at 5 with Daniel Vance, who Ryan was meeting for the first time, and who turned out to be a quiet man in his mid-40s with the slightly distracted manner of someone whose brain is always running a parallel process. Vance had looked at the engine for approximately 90 seconds before saying anything, and what he said was, "This is Phase 3 architecture." He said it the way you say something you recognize from a long time ago, a voice, a smell, a particular configuration of things you'd thought you'd never see again. "You worked on Phase 2, Ryan said. "And the early Phase 3 concept work," Vance said. He looked at Ryan steadily. "I left before the test. I knew something was wrong with the direction the project was taking, but I didn't have the standing to." He stopped. "I left." "I know," Ryan said. He didn't say it with judgment. He said it as a fact because that was what it was. Vance nodded, and something in the nod carried the weight of a man who had been living with a specific kind of guilt. The guilt of someone who saw something coming and chose distance over confrontation for several years. Ryan didn't have the space to address that right now. He filed it and moved on. Sophia had brought 2 things Ryan hadn't asked for but found he was glad to have: a professional-grade camera setup operated by a technician named Park, who had been briefed on confidentiality and who moved through the space quietly and efficiently, and a set of independent diagnostic instruments that Vance would use in parallel with Ryan's own to produce a second corroborating data record. "I said no cameras at the Friday meeting," Ryan said to Sophia when he saw Park setting up. "You said no cameras to the garage meeting," she said. "This is a documentation run. Documentation requires documentation." She looked at him. "If we're going to use this footage, you need it to be unimpeachable. One camera in a parking lot is a viral video. A proper multi-angle recording with timestamp data logs is evidence." He couldn't argue with this. It was correct. He'd known it was correct and hadn't gotten there himself yet because he'd been managing 10 things at once, and documentation quality was the thing that had slipped. "Fine," he said. "Also," Sophia said, "I called Lars Henriksen." Ryan looked at her. "The automotive journalist," she said, "the one whose comment had 42,000 likes. He's been trying to identify the engine for 3 weeks. I told him to be here at 6:30. "You told a journalist." "I told him the source of the video had agreed to an on-record conversation," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were watching him carefully, reading his reaction. "Ryan, I understand you want to control this. I understand why. But a journalist of Henriksen's credibility being present for the documentation run changes what this footage is. It changes who can dismiss it and how." He stood very still. He was angry, not explosively, but in the pressurized way of someone who has spent 4 years controlling every variable they could control and has just had a significant variable taken out of their hands without being asked. "You should have asked me," he said. "Yes," she said, without any qualification. "I should have. I made a decision I thought was right, and I didn't consult you first. That was wrong." She held his gaze. "But Henriksen is already on his way." He looked at the car. He looked at the time, 5:53. He thought about the patent filing Sophia had texted him about. Same core architecture, different company name, filed 6 weeks ago. Someone was moving. The timeline was already compressed. A journalist of Henriksen's standing, present for a verified documentation run, changed the protection calculus significantly. If this became a story with a credible witness on record, the cost of suppression became much higher. He knew this. He'd known it when he thought about it in the abstract. He just hadn't made the decision yet. Sophia had made it for him. After this, he said, you ask. Whatever comes next, you ask. Agreed, she said simply. Lars Henriksen arrived at 6:27, 3 minutes early, in a rental car he'd driven from the airport. He was a compact man in his 50s with a gray beard and the specific energy of a journalist who has been in the field long enough to have stopped being excitable, but had not stopped being curious. He shook Ryan's hand and looked at the car, and then looked at Ryan again with an expression that recalibrated visibly, the way people's expressions did when they matched a face to a context they hadn't expected. You're the one who rebuilt this, Henriksen said. Yes. Are you going to tell me what it is? After the run, Ryan said. Henriksen accepted this with the patience of someone who understood that sources controlled their own timing and went to stand with Sophia near the wall. The documentation run lasted 40 minutes. It was not 40 minutes of uninterrupted triumph. The first pass had a calibration variance that Ryan caught on the data readout after the first 100 meters and corrected before the second pass. The correction took 11 minutes and involved a conversation with Vance that was technical and somewhat tense. Because Vance had a different read on the variant source than Ryan did, and they had to work through the disagreement with the car sitting between them, like a patient waiting for 2 doctors to agree on a diagnosis. Ryan was right about the source, which he established by walking Vance through the data sequence, and Vance accepted the correction without resentment. The clean acceptance of someone who cares about getting it right more than about being right. The second pass was clean. The third pass was the one that mattered. Ryan drove it himself. He'd driven the car in the parking lot tests, but those had been constrained and cautious. This was different, a longer straight, a proper load sequence, the data systems running simultaneously on both sets of equipment. He ran the Meridian system through its full performance range in a controlled ramp, watching the gauges, listening to the engine, feeling through the controls the specific quality of a machine operating the way it was designed to operate. The numbers that came back were the same numbers he'd documented in the parking lot, now independently verified by Vance's instrumentation and recorded on camera with timestamp data. They were extraordinary. Vance, standing at his monitoring station, went very quiet as the figures populated. That's not possible, Vance said, almost to himself. That's what the data says, Ryan said. Vance looked at the readout for a long time. Then he said, this is what Phase 3 was supposed to be. This is what we were building toward. He paused. Nobody believed it was achievable, even inside the project. I believed it, Ryan said. Vance looked at him. I know you did. That's why they needed you to be the one responsible when it failed. The room was very quiet after that. Henriksen was in the corner, not recording. Ryan had told him no recording during the run itself, but writing in a small notebook with the focused speed of someone capturing things they intend to use. He looked up from the notebook and met Ryan's eyes, and the question in his expression was plain. Are you ready to talk? Ryan looked at the car. He looked at Vance. He looked at Sophia, who was standing against the wall with her arms crossed, and an expression that was difficult to read. Not quite recognition, not quite something else, a combination of things that were still sorting themselves out on her face. Yeah, Ryan said to Henriksen, let's talk. They talked for 2 hours. Ryan had never been comfortable with extended self-disclosure, had in fact organized his life for 4 years around the discipline of not explaining himself to people who hadn't earned the explanation. But Henriksen was good at his job in the specific way that made people forget they were being interviewed, which was, he listened more than he spoke, asked questions that were precise without being leading, and had the practiced ability to sit with silence without filling it, which meant that Ryan had to fill it himself or let things end. And the things Ryan chose to fill it with were, he found, more than he'd planned to say. He talked about the Meridian project and the test and the investigation report with his name on it. He talked about the document in the waterproof case and what it contained. He talked about the recordings. He didn't play the recordings for Henriksen, not yet. That was a decision for a later moment with legal input he didn't have yet. But he described their content specifically enough that Henriksen could understand what they evidenced. He talked about buying the car, about the engine block stamp and the chassis measurements, and the 3 weeks of documentation before he was certain of what he had. About Maya handing him tools in the garage at night while she did her spelling worksheets. Henriksen wrote that detail down and then looked up. Your daughter was present for the restoration. Most of it, Ryan said. How old? 7 now, 6 when it started. Henriksen wrote something else. Ryan didn't ask what. He understood that the human detail of a single father and a 7-year-old girl in a dead car in a 12-foot garage was not separate from the story. It was the story, the part that made everything else legible. When the interview was done, Henriksen closed his notebook and looked at Ryan directly. I've covered automotive fraud cases before, twice. Both times the story broke before the subjects were ready, and the people involved paid for that. He paused. When are you planning to go public? Hargrove is responding to the video within the week, Sophia said from across the room. We've been monitoring. They've identified Millhaven as the source location, and they're running employment records. She looked at Ryan. They may already know it's you. Then we need the exhibition, Ryan said. Henriksen looked between them. What exhibition? Ryan said, The Aurelian Motor Show. It opens in 12 days. The Aurelian Motor Show was the largest automotive exhibition in the Northeast. 3 days, 40,000 attendees, every major manufacturer and distributor represented. Press from 50 outlets, a keynote stage that had historically been used for significant industry announcements. It was by design and tradition the highest profile automotive venue in the region. Ryan had been thinking about it for 2 months. You're going to take the car there, Henriksen said. It wasn't a question. I'm going to drive it there, Ryan said, and I'm going to present the evidence on the keynote stage. Henriksen absorbed this. Do you have a slot on the keynote stage? Not yet. Then how? I have a relationship with the show's technical director, Sophia said, and I'm a featured exhibitor. She looked at Ryan. I've been holding a 30-minute keynote slot since February. I haven't announced what it's for. Ryan looked at her. He hadn't known this. She hadn't told him. He wasn't sure whether to be grateful or unsettled, and landed somewhere between the two. You've been planning this, he said. I've been preparing options, she said carefully. I didn't know what I'd need them for when I reserved the slot. I knew I'd find something worth saying. She held his gaze. I think I found it. There was a long beat between them. It's a risk, Henriksen said, looking at Ryan. Public venue, live audience, press present. If Hargrove gets legal interference in before you present, that's why the documentation needs to be filed before we get there, Ryan said. He'd been thinking through the sequence for the past 36 hours. The technical verification data goes to a patent attorney today. The audit document and the recordings go to an investigative legal team. I need a referral. He looked at Sophia. Can you? I have a firm, she said. Chandler and Associates. They've handled whistleblower cases before. I'll make the call this morning. I also need the documents filed with the State Automotive Regulatory Board before the show, so that when I walk onto that stage, the evidence isn't only in my hands. Henriksen was watching him with the particular attention of a man recognizing when someone has been thinking more carefully than the situation requires, which he was beginning to understand was simply how Ryan Carter operated. You've been planning the legal architecture since before the video, Henriksen said. I've been planning the legal architecture since I found the document, Ryan said. The video changed the timing. Everything else I've been working toward. That afternoon moved at a different pace than any afternoon Ryan had experienced in the past 4 years. Not faster, exactly, but more densely populated with consequence. Sophia made calls from her car in the parking lot of the facility, while Ryan and Vance worked through the technical documentation, organizing the schematics and verification data into a format the patent attorney could work with quickly. Henriksen left to file a preliminary story, not the full account, not yet, but a piece that established his presence and the car's existence in the public record. A piece that would make a sudden disappearance of the story conspicuous rather than clean. Ryan called Mrs. Delgado and asked her to pick up Maya from school and keep her for the evening. Mrs. Delgado said yes without asking questions, which was one of the many ways she had been indispensable over the past 2 years. He called the Chandler firm at 2 in the afternoon, after Sophia had made the introduction. The attorney who handled his initial intake was a woman named Rosario, brisk, methodical, with the particular manner of someone who had heard a lot of stories and was reserving judgment on this one while simultaneously beginning to act on it. She asked him to messenger the physical documents to the firm's office by end of day and to send the digital copies by encrypted transfer, which he did. She told him not to discuss the content of the recordings with anyone not covered by attorney-client privilege until she'd reviewed them. He told her he understood. At 4 in the afternoon, his phone rang. The number was a Hargrove corporate line. He looked at it for a moment. He let it ring twice more, then answered. Ryan. Morrison's voice, smooth and controlled in the way of someone who has had a lot of practice at smooth and controlled, but was applying slightly more effort than usual. We've been trying to reach you. I haven't been available, Ryan said. Yes, I can see that. You called in sick on Sunday. A pause. There's a video circulating. I'm sure you've seen it. We have reason to believe the vehicle in the video may be connected to some proprietary Hargrove equipment, and we'd like to I know what the vehicle is, Ryan said. Silence. A different kind of silence than Morrison's usual professional pauses, sharper, with an edge of recalibration. Ryan, I found it at the Vandermeer liquidation in November, Ryan said. I bought it for $900. I've spent 7 months restoring it. He paused. I know what's in it, Mr. Morrison. I know what it is, and I know where it came from, and I know why it was hidden. Another pause. I also know why my name was on the investigation report. A very long silence. When Morrison spoke again, the smoothness was still there, but it was doing more work. I think we should meet in person. There may be... I won't be coming to Hargrove, Ryan said, and anything you want to say to me, you can say to my attorney. He gave Morrison the Chandler firm's number, which he had memorized. Have a good afternoon. He hung up. He sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. His heart was going faster than he wanted it to. Not dramatically, just enough to remind him that the body registers things the mind tries to process analytically. He took a breath. Then he put the phone in his pocket and went back to work. 3 days before the Aurelian Motor Show, someone tried to buy the car. Not through normal channels, not a phone call, not a formal offer. Ryan came to the garage on a Tuesday evening to find a handwritten note slipped under the door. The note was on expensive stationery, cream-colored, heavyweight paper, the kind that announces itself. It contained a number, 8 figures, and beneath the number, a line, for your daughter's future. No further complications. Ryan read the note twice. He folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket because it was evidence. Then he stood in the garage in the dark for a moment, not turning the light on yet. For your daughter's future. He thought about who had written that line, thought about what they'd understood, that the car and the technical evidence were one problem, but Maya was a different kind of leverage, one that could be worked on at a different angle. An 8-figure number was intimidation dressed as generosity. The implication was clear. Take this and your daughter has a future. Don't take it. And the implication of the second half of the sentence resolved itself in whatever way they chose. He turned on the light. The car sat in front of him, complete. He looked at it for a while. Then he took out his phone and sent Rosario the photograph he'd taken of the note. She called him back in 4 minutes. This is a potential coercive communication, she said. Don't respond. Don't make any statement about it. We're filing it as part of the case record tonight. Do you have security on your apartment? I have a neighbor who pays attention, Ryan said. That's not what I understand the risk, Ryan said. I've understood it for a while. He paused. Can you file for an expedited injunction against any suppression attempt before the show? We filed this afternoon, Rosario said. The regulatory submissions went in this morning. You're in the public record now, Ryan. That changes the math on interference. He thanked her and ended the call. He called Sophia next. He told her about the note. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, Where is Maya right now? At the apartment, he said. Mrs. Delgado's there. I'm going to have someone I trust, not corporate, personal, stay nearby for the next 3 days. You won't see them, and Maya won't know. I'm not asking your permission because this isn't about the car. It's about a 7-year-old girl, and I'm not going to pretend that's negotiable. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He wanted to argue. He had spent 4 years not needing anyone to handle things for him, and accepting help still had the quality of lowering a guard he'd raised for good reasons. But the note had said for your daughter's future, and the implication was not subtle, and Ryan Carter was many things, but he was not a man who let pride interfere with Maya's safety. Okay, he said. Okay, Sophia said. Get some sleep. He didn't sleep much, but he tried. The morning of the Aurelian Motor Show arrived cold and bright, with the kind of late spring clarity that felt, to Ryan, less like beauty and more like pressure. The specific quality of a day that has been a long time coming and has arrived with its expectations fully formed. He drove the Aston Martin to the show himself. He'd arranged the logistics carefully, a confirmed transport slot, a registered exhibitor pass obtained through Sophia's entry, a specific hall assignment. The car drew attention in the parking structure the moment he pulled in. This was expected. He moved through the logistics without stopping, answered no questions, kept his head down in the way he'd learned to keep his head down for 4 years. Sophia met him at the entrance to Hall B. She was dressed differently than he'd seen her, sharper, more formal, the CEO presenting rather than the person investigating. Her face was composed in the way faces get composed before something important. Rosario called, she said. The injunction was granted this morning. Any attempt to remove the vehicle from the venue or to suppress the presentation is subject to immediate legal action. She paused. Hargrove's attorneys have been circling the show's legal team since yesterday. They filed a counter request. It was denied. Morrison is here? Ryan asked. Not yet. Ashford is. He arrived an hour ago. She watched Ryan's face. He knows. Of course he did. Ryan processed this without visible reaction. Ashford being here was, in a way, the completion of something. A circle closing in a specific and necessary way. And the stage? Ryan said. Ready. Henriksen is there. I've confirmed verification of the documentation with 3 independent engineering contacts who reviewed Vance's data overnight. They'll be in the room. She paused. Ryan. He looked at her. Are you ready? He thought about the auction lot in November. The rust and diesel smell, the crowd with their paddles and lukewarm coffee, the car in the back row under a gray sky. He thought about the first night in the garage with a flashlight and a working theory and $900 he didn't have. He thought about Maya at the corner desk with her spelling worksheets, the engine turning over at 11:30 on a Saturday, the 7th audio file, Morrison's voice on the phone 3 days ago going smooth and controlled and slightly too careful. He thought about standing at the investigation summary meeting at 27 years old saying, "This is wrong," while 2 people in HR looked at him with practiced sympathy and a decision already made. Yeah, he said. I'm ready. The keynote stage at the Aurelian Motor Show was a raised platform at the center of the main hall, surrounded on 3 sides by tiered viewing. Industry professionals, journalists, exhibitors. It held perhaps 400 people when full. By the time Sophia took the stage to open her slot, it was full. She began with the engine video. She played it on the main screen without introduction. Just the 47 seconds of dark parking lot and that sound, filling the hall. She let it run twice. The room was very quiet the second time through, with the quality of silence that gathers when a large number of people are paying close attention. Then she said, 3 weeks ago, 22 million people heard this. Today, you're going to find out what it is, and you're going to find out how it almost disappeared forever. She paused. I'd like to introduce Ryan Carter. He walked onto the stage from the side entrance, and the first thing he saw when he reached the center was the car, which had been moved to the stage while he waited, positioned under the main lights, its imperfect exterior and rebuilt engine bay, and 7 months of hard work visible to 400 people and every camera in the room. He looked out at the audience. He found Henriksen in the 3rd row, notebook open. He found Vance near the back, standing. He found Ashford, near the side wall, whose face had the gray and rigid quality of a man watching something he'd spent years preventing arrive anyway. Ryan looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. Then he looked at the room. He didn't have notes. He'd thought about preparing them and decided against it because notes made it a presentation, and this wasn't a presentation. It was an account. He'd been holding the account for 4 years and he was going to give it now, simply and completely, and let the evidence do what evidence does when it's real. He started talking. He talked about the Meridian Project, what it was, what it had been built to do, what it would have meant for the industry if it had reached market. He talked about the test and the investigation and the report with his name on it. He talked about the audit document and the recordings with the precision of someone who has reviewed evidence so many times it has become part of their architecture. He put up the documentation on the screen behind him. Not the recordings, not yet, but the written record, the signatures, the timeline. The room got very quiet. He talked about the car, the auction, $900 and a flashlight and a theory. He talked about what was hidden in the waterproof case behind the rear bulkhead and what the waterproof case contained and what the 7th audio file said. He said the names, Ashford, Morrison, Calloway. He said, after the test, Carter's documentation will support the finding we need. He said, we're in the business of controlling when and how they surface. When he finished, the silence lasted for approximately 4 seconds. Then it broke in multiple directions simultaneously. Journalists moving, phones coming up, the low sustained sound of 400 people responding to something they had not expected to witness. Ryan stood on the stage and looked at the car beside him, and then he looked at the audience, and he found the spot near the side wall where Ashford had been standing. Ashford was gone. He'd left during the presentation, sometime in the middle, when the documentation had gone up on screen, when the weight of what was coming had apparently exceeded what he could stand to remain present for. Ryan had half expected it. The leaving didn't matter. What mattered was what was in the public record, what was in Rosario's files, what was on camera in front of 400 witnesses. What mattered was the car on the stage, running. Sophia had started the engine during the evidence presentation, a choice Ryan hadn't anticipated but understood immediately. Its sound filling the hall the way it had filled that parking lot on a cold night in April. The sound that was impossible and wasn't. The sound that had started as 47 seconds on a social media post and had traveled in 3 weeks to this room. Ryan stood in front of it and let the room do what it was going to do. Sophia came to stand beside him. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, which was, Ryan found, enough. Off to the right, Henriksen was already on the phone. The room didn't settle for a long time after Ryan stopped talking. It settled in stages, the way a body of water settles after something large has fallen into it. The initial disruption spreading outward in rings, each ring smaller but still moving. The surface not returning to stillness for longer than you'd expect. Journalists were on phones within seconds of his last word. The cluster near the press area had the compressed, urgent quality of people who understood they were sitting on a significant story and were already competing to be first with it. 3 separate camera crews repositioned simultaneously. Henriksen stayed in his seat in the 3rd row, not moving, writing in his notebook with the focused speed of someone who had been in this business long enough to know that the first account mattered, and that getting it right mattered more than getting it fast. Ryan stood on the stage beside the running engine and let the room do what it was going to do, because there was nothing left to manage. He had given what he had. The evidence was in the public record, in Rosario's files, in the hands of the regulatory board, on video in front of 400 witnesses. The story was no longer his alone to carry. That feeling of something heavy being distributed across more hands than just his own was strange in a way he hadn't anticipated. Not relief exactly, something more complicated than relief. 4 years of weight doesn't simply lift, it relocates. Sophia touched his arm lightly. "We need to move to the side," she said, close enough that only he could hear it. "The show's security is going to want to clear the stage." He nodded and walked with her to the side of the platform, and as he descended the steps he saw, in the audience, faces he could read even from a distance. Vance, near the back wall, whose expression had the quality of someone who had finally put down something they'd been carrying too long and wasn't sure their arms remembered what empty felt like. Several industry people he didn't know personally, but recognized from trade coverage, executives, engineers, people who were going to have to go back to their own organizations and think carefully about what they'd just heard. And near the side exit, partially in shadow, a figure that was no longer Ashford, but was someone Ryan recognized with a different and more complicated set of feelings. Morrison. Not gone, as Ryan had assumed. Still here, against one of the walls, watching the stage with the expression of a man who had been calculating options and had reached the point in the calculation where none of them were good. Their eyes met across the room. Morrison looked away first. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have mattered after everything, but Ryan felt it land somewhere specific and stay there. The plain, uncomplicated fact of a man who had spent 4 years certain of his own position discovering, in real time, that the position had shifted beneath him. Ryan turned away and walked with Sophia into the corridor behind the stage. The next 72 hours were the most structurally chaotic of Ryan's adult life, which was saying something given the competition. Henriksen's piece ran at 11 that night, a full account, meticulously sourced, with the verification data from Vance and 2 of the independent engineering contacts, the documentary evidence summarized with the precision of someone who understood both its technical and its legal significance. It ran on a platform with 9 million subscribers and was picked up by 14 other outlets before midnight. By morning, it was everywhere. Ryan knew this because his phone stopped being manageable around 6 a.m. Calls from numbers he didn't recognize, texts from people he'd lost contact with years ago, a voicemail from his former Hargrove supervisor, Mercer, that began, "Ryan, I don't know if you'll get this, but I just want to say," and which Ryan listened to once and then couldn't bring himself to listen to again for a while, because Mercer's voice had something in it that Ryan hadn't heard directed at him in a very long time. Something that sounded like, "I'm sorry," without those specific words. He sat at his kitchen table with Maya eating breakfast across from him, the way they did every morning, and tried to make that morning feel like every morning. He mostly succeeded because Maya was eating cereal and explaining, with some intensity, a disagreement she'd had with a friend about the correct way to fold paper cranes, and the specificity of the disagreement required his attention. "She was folding the wing wrong," Maya said, "and when I showed her the right way, she said I was being bossy." "Were you being bossy?" Ryan asked. Maya considered this seriously. "Maybe a little, but I was also right. Both things can be true." "That seems unfair." "It is sometimes," Ryan said. "Being right doesn't always feel the way you think it's going to feel." She looked at him. She was 7, and she had the particular perceptiveness of a child who has spent a lot of time around an adult who says fewer things than he means, which had trained her to listen for the gap between what was said and what was meant. "Is that about the car?" she asked. He looked at her. "A little," he said. "Yeah." She thought about this. Then she went back to her cereal. He dropped her at school and came home and sat in the apartment and tried to process what came next. Rosario called at 8:30 with an update that was complicated enough that he had to write parts of it down. The regulatory board had opened a formal investigation into the Meridian project failure the previous afternoon, citing the documentation Ryan had submitted as the basis for review. Hargrove's legal team had issued a statement, a careful, bloodless statement that neither confirmed nor denied specific allegations and used the phrase ongoing review 4 times, which Rosario characterized as the corporate equivalent of a person backing slowly toward a door. Ashford had retained private counsel and had not been reachable since leaving the exhibition hall. Morrison had issued nothing publicly and had stopped returning calls from journalists, which itself was a kind of statement. The patent filing, the fraudulent one, filed 6 weeks ago under a different company name with the Meridian architecture, had been formally challenged by Ryan's attorney using the documentation from the waterproof case. The filing was suspended pending review, which in legal terms meant it was effectively dead. Calloway, the third voice on the 7th audio file, had not made a public statement, and his position at Meridian Capital Group had been listed on their website as vacant as of that morning, the kind of update that happens quickly when an organization is trying to separate itself from something before the association hardens. "What does this mean for the timeline of the formal case?" Ryan asked. "It means we're in a process that takes months, not days," Rosario said. The regulatory investigation runs its own timeline. The civil case, if you pursue one, and I think you should, runs another. Criminal referrals, if the board decides the evidence supports them, are a third track. She paused. Ryan, I need you to understand something. The truth is out. That happened yesterday, and it cannot be undone. But the institutional process of accountability moves at institutional speed. That's going to be frustrating. I've been waiting 4 years, Ryan said. I can wait longer. Good, she said. Also, you're going to be approached about the technology, licensing, partnerships, acquisition, multiple parties, and soon. You need to decide what you want before those conversations start, so you don't get pushed into a position reactively. He'd been thinking about this since the show. Since before the show, actually. He'd been thinking about it since the night the engine first ran, in a quiet, back-of-mind way that hadn't resolved into a decision until recently. I'm not selling it, he said. The car or the technology? Either, he paused. I want to open source the technical documentation, file it publicly so nobody can patent it and nobody can lock it up, make it available to any engineer who wants to build on it. Silence on the line for a moment. That's a significant financial decision, Rosario said carefully. I know what it is. The technology is worth... I know what it's worth, Ryan said. I also know what it cost, and I know what it was built for. It wasn't built to make one company's shareholders richer. It was built to change how engines work. He paused. Let it do what it was built to do. Another silence. Then Rosario said, I'll start the filing process. You understand that once it's public, it's public. You can't reverse that. That's the point, Ryan said. He called Sophia an hour later to tell her. She was quiet for a moment after he explained. You're walking away from a significant amount of money, she said. I'm aware. I'm not arguing, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm just... She paused. Most people in your position would take the money. You've earned it. You spent 4 years and everything you had to get here. I spent 4 years trying to prove the truth, Ryan said. The technology being free is part of the truth. It was always supposed to reach the world. That's why they buried it, because it would have changed the market. Making it proprietary now would just create a different version of the same problem. She was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. What do you need? I need to open a business, he said. A restoration company. Something real, with actual work and actual employees. People who know what they're doing but haven't been given the opportunity to prove it. He paused. People like me. 5 years ago. He heard something shift in her voice. Something that wasn't surprise exactly, because she'd known him long enough now to know that impractical generosity wasn't actually impractical when it came from a clearly held principle. I'll help you set it up, she said. Structure, financing, the practical things, if you want that. I want it, he said, but it runs the way I want it to run. Of course. I mean it, Sophia. This isn't a partnership where I tell you what I'm doing and you tell me how to do it better. I know. A pause. Ryan, I spent 6 months watching you figure out things I didn't think were possible, in a 12-foot garage with a 7-year-old helping. I have enough sense to know when I'm not the smartest person in the room. He almost smiled. That must be uncomfortable for you. Extremely, she said, and there was something in her voice that was dry and warm at the same time, a combination he'd come to recognize as one of her more honest registers. The formal investigation by the State Automotive Regulatory Board took 4 months to produce its initial findings. Ryan knew this was fast by regulatory standards and slow by human ones, and he spent those 4 months building the thing he'd told Rosario and Sophia he wanted to build, which was harder and more specific than he'd made it sound. The restoration company. He named it Meridian Workshop, which Sophia called both obvious and correct, opened in a building he rented in the same industrial district where the Vandermeer auction had been held. He wasn't sure whether choosing that location was meaningful or just practical, and eventually decided it was both, and that was fine. The building was larger than the garage by a factor of 15 and required 3 months of renovation before it was usable, which he did himself with help. He hired 6 people in the first cohort. Vance, who accepted with the specific relief of someone moving from a situation that had never quite fit to one that did. A young woman named Celeste, who had been working at a dealership service center and had the same instinct with engines that Ryan had recognized in himself at 12, the kind that didn't need teaching, just direction. A machinist named Ford, who was 53 and had been laid off when a parts plant closed, and who Ryan had met through Torres, the facility owner, and who turned out to have the most precise hands Ryan had ever seen on a person. 3 others, each with something specific they were good at, and a history of being underestimated. Ryan told them at the first meeting in the workshop before the renovation was finished, sitting on folding chairs in a space that still smelled like construction. "I'm not going to manage you. I'm going to work with you. If you have a better idea about how to do something, I want to hear it. If you disagree with the decision I've made, tell me directly and explain your reasoning. We do good work and we do honest work, and we treat the people who bring their cars here the way we'd want to be treated." He paused. "That's most of the policy." Ford raised his hand. "What about the car, the Aston Martin? What about it? Is it staying here?" Ryan looked around the workshop. He thought about the car in the 12-foot garage with the buzzing fluorescent light and the concrete floor that held cold. He thought about it on the stage at the Aurelian Motor Show with its engine running and 400 people in the room. He thought about a gray November morning and $900 and a receipt folded carefully in his jacket pocket. "Yeah," he said, "it's staying here." The regulatory board's findings, when they came, were specific in ways that Ryan had prepared for and still found unexpectedly difficult to sit with. The report confirmed the falsification of the investigation record. It confirmed Ashford's role in the pretest configuration sign-off and the subsequent attribution of responsibility to Ryan. It confirmed the existence of communications between Hargrove executives and representatives of Meridian Capital Group regarding the suppression of the Phase 3 results. It recommended referral to law enforcement for criminal investigation of 3 named individuals, one of whom was Ashford, one Morrison, and one whose name in the report was redacted pending legal process, but whose identity Ryan already knew. The report also, in its final section, contained a formal finding that Ryan Carter had exercised appropriate professional judgment in flagging the thermal management issue prior to the test, that his documented concerns had been dismissed by his supervisors, and that the attribution of responsibility for the test failure to Mr. Carter was not supported by the available evidence and was inconsistent with the factual record. Rosario read him that section over the phone, and when she finished, there was silence on the line for a moment. "Ryan," she said. "Yeah," he said. "That's it," she said. "That's the formal clearing. Everything after this is process. Legal process, potentially years of it, but that finding is in the permanent record. That's what stands." He was in the workshop when she called, standing at the main workbench with a cup of coffee, alone, because it was 7 in the morning and the others didn't come in until 8. The Aston Martin was in the corner of the space, parked the way it had been since they moved in, not being worked on, just present. Not a project anymore. Something else. He looked at it for a while after the call ended. He thought about 27 years old and a conference table and 2 HR people with their hands folded and a decision already made. He thought about the particular quality of that moment, the way it had felt less like devastation in the immediate aftermath, and more like a door closing, the soft and irrevocable click of something becoming permanent. He'd spent a long time with that sound. It was different now. Not gone. The past doesn't change, no matter what documents say about it, but different in the way that a wound is different once it's acknowledged rather than ignored. Still real, but no longer the thing that organized everything around itself. He drank his coffee and let the morning be what it was. Ashford's criminal case moved slowly, as criminal cases do. His attorney mounted a technical defense that Rosario described, with the specificity of professional contempt, as threading needles that aren't there. Morrison reached a civil settlement that included terms Ryan was not party to negotiating, but which Rosario confirmed were significant. Callaway, who had remained publicly absent throughout, was named in the criminal referral 4 months after the regulatory report and retained counsel 2 days later. The story moved in and out of the news cycle the way these things do. Prominent when something happened, quiet when nothing did, never quite disappearing. Ryan did not spend a lot of time tracking it. He had work to do. The workshop took its first outside commission 8 weeks after opening. A 1968 Ferrari that belonged to a collector in Connecticut who had heard about Ryan through Henrikson's reporting and who arrived skeptical and left, after walking through the workshop and talking with Ryan for an hour, considerably less so. The car was there for 3 months. When it left, the collector told 3 other people, who told others, and the workshop's calendar filled with the kind of organic density that is what happens when the work speaks more clearly than any marketing. Celeste turned out to be as good as Ryan had thought, and better in specific areas. She had a particular skill with electrical systems that exceeded his own, which he told her directly, because pretending otherwise would have been both dishonest and wasteful. She accepted the acknowledgement without embarrassment, which he appreciated. Ford built a reputation within 3 months as someone whose metalwork was precise enough that clients who cared deeply about originality specifically requested him. He was not expressive about this. He showed up at 7 and worked until 5, and did not take long lunches and produced work that made other craftsmen look at it and ask how. Vance found, in the workshop environment, something that Ryan had suspected he was looking for. A context in which his knowledge was used in service of actual things rather than institutional processes, where the gap between what he knew and what he was permitted to say had been closed by the events of the past months. He was quieter than the others and took longer to integrate, and at the end of the 3rd month, Ryan found him in the workshop after hours, alone, working on the Aston Martin's documentation. Not the car itself, but the technical record, organizing and annotating the schematics that had now been publicly filed. "You don't have to do that," Ryan said from the doorway. Vance looked up. "I know," he said. "I want to." He paused. "I should have stayed in the project, 8 months before the test. I should have stayed and pushed harder." He looked at the documents. "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to fight it." "I'm not sure I knew how either," Ryan said. "I just didn't have the option of leaving." Vance looked at him. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "No," Ryan said. "It's just what was true." He paused. "You're here now. That's what matters." It wasn't a complete absolution, and both of them knew it, but it was honest, and it moved them past the moment into the next one, which was all it needed to do. Maya started 2nd grade at a new school that fall. A school closer to the workshop, in a neighborhood that was neither better nor worse than the previous one, but was different in ways that had taken her 2 weeks to assess, and which she reported on with the specific thoroughness of a child who takes change seriously. She had opinions about the lunch situation, the reading program, and the quality of the art supplies, which she communicated with the directness that Ryan had learned years ago she'd inherited from somewhere in him that he usually kept more contained. She visited the workshop on Saturdays. She had, over the course of the year, been introduced to Celeste and Ford and Vance and the others, and had developed individual relationships with each of them characterized by the same pragmatic assessment she applied to everything. She liked Celeste best. They had a rapport that seemed to be based primarily on Celeste's willingness to explain mechanical processes without oversimplifying, which Maya valued in a way that was very specific and recognizable to Ryan. She had also, in the fall, met Sophia properly for the first time. Ryan had been managing that introduction carefully, not for complicated reasons, but because Maya was perceptive enough that any performance of naturalness would register as performance, and because Sophia was not a person who adjusted easily to audiences she hadn't prepared for. He'd mentioned Sophia the way you mention significant things in the periphery of a child's life, consistently, without overemphasis, until the name was familiar before the person was. When they met, in the workshop on a Saturday morning, Maya assessed Sophia for approximately 30 seconds with the same expression she used on everything she was forming an opinion about. Then she said, "You were at the auction. You said Dad's car was a financial disaster." Sophia looked at her. "Yes," she said, "I did." "Were you wrong?" "Very," Sophia said, without any of the softening that adults usually applied to admissions of wrongness made to children. Maya nodded. "Okay," she said, and went back to the workbench where Celeste was showing her something. Ryan watched this exchange from across the workshop. Sophia caught his eyes, and something passed between them that was partly amusement and partly something more serious. The recognition of two people who have been through something together and have arrived at a place that neither of them fully mapped out in advance. His relationship with Sophia was not a simple thing, and he wasn't going to pretend it was. It had grown in the same conditions that most real things grow in, under pressure, with imperfect information, through disagreements that were sometimes significant and had to be worked through rather than smoothed over. She had continued to run the Bennett Group with the same relentlessness that had built it, which meant that her attention was fractured in ways that produced friction, and she had a tendency to make decisions at speed that required the conversation Ryan had told her to have with him at the start of things. She was working on it. He was working on being more direct about when it bothered him rather than absorbing it and moving on, which was an older habit that predated her and was genuinely his to fix. They were not without complications, but they were honest about the complications, which was more than he'd expected from any relationship in a long time. And it turned out that honesty was a more functional foundation than he'd remembered it being. One morning in early spring, a Tuesday, the kind of morning that arrives without announcing itself, Ryan drove to the workshop early and sat in his car in the parking lot before going in, which was something he almost never did. He was not by temperament a person who sat with things unnecessarily, but something about the specific configuration of that morning, the light, the quiet industrial street, the workshop sign visible through the windshield, made him stay where he was for a moment. He thought about the auction lot in November, the gray sky and the rust smell and the car that everyone had already decided was worthless. He thought about the specific stubbornness, not confidence, stubbornness, which is a different thing, less sure of itself and more committed, that had made him raise his paddle. He'd been asked, in a profile Henriksen wrote 3 months after the motor show, what made him buy the car when everyone else had dismissed it. He'd thought about it before answering, which had been visible on the recording, a pause long enough that Henriksen had let it run without prompting. What he'd said was, "I'd spent 4 years being told I was wrong about something I knew I was right about. After a while, you either start believing the people telling you you're wrong, or you develop a very specific relationship with your own judgment." He'd paused again. "I looked at that car, and I saw a pattern that didn't match what everyone was saying about it. I didn't know exactly what the pattern meant, but I knew it meant something." Another pause. "That's all it was. I just believed my own eyes when other people had decided not to." The profile had been read a lot. He'd gotten letters, actual letters, physical ones, from engineers, from people who had been wrongly blamed for things, from people who had given up on something and were reconsidering. He read them all. He answered some. He sat in the parking lot and thought about those letters. About what it meant that a story about a car and a falsified report and a 7-month restoration had reached people in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not as an industry story, though it was that, but as something more personal, more human. A story about what happens when you refuse to accept a verdict that was decided before the evidence was considered. The evidence mattered. The documentation, the recordings, the regulatory finding, all of it mattered, and none of it would have existed without Ryan's patient, methodical 4-year refusal to let the record stand unchallenged. But what the letters were about, what the people writing them were responding to, was something underneath the evidence, something about the specific quality of holding on to a true thing in a context where everyone has decided it isn't true, and how rare that is, and how difficult, and how it looks from the outside like stubbornness or delusion right up until the moment it doesn't. He didn't think of himself as a symbol. He was uncomfortable with the framing when journalists applied it, which they did frequently in the months after the show. He was a person who had done specific things for specific reasons, and the specific reasons were his daughter and his work, and a principle about truth that was less philosophical than personal. He hadn't been trying to establish anything larger than the facts of what had happened to him and to the car and to the technology. But he understood, sitting in the parking lot on a Tuesday morning, that the story had become something beyond his intention, that when you do a true thing in public, it becomes available to other people in ways you don't control, that this was not something to be managed, but something to be accepted. He got out of the car. The workshop in the morning, before anyone else arrived, had a particular quality he'd come to value, the smell of metal and oil and the good, particular smell of a space where careful work was done. The equipment arranged with the logic of people who understood it. The Aston Martin in its corner catching the morning light through the high windows in a way that made it look both ordinary and not. He walked to it. He stood beside it the way he'd stood beside it in the 12-foot garage on the first night, when it had been gutted and rusted and declared worthless, and he'd crouched in the gravel with a flashlight, looking at an engine block stamp that nobody else had thought was worth examining. The car was not perfect. It had never been made perfect. The bodywork showed its repair history in places where a more comprehensive restoration would have hidden it, and Ryan had decided somewhere in the final weeks of the work to leave those marks rather than erase them. He hadn't done it for symbolic reasons, or not only for symbolic reasons. He'd done it because the marks were honest, and because the history they evidenced was real, and because erasing evidence of what a thing had survived in order to make it look like it had never been damaged was a practice he'd had enough of. It looked like what it was. Something that had been broken and fixed by someone who knew what they were doing. Something that carried its history in its surface rather than pretending to be new. He put his hand on the roof, the simple, flat gesture of someone acknowledging something without performing the acknowledgement. The metal was cool in the morning. He thought about Maya asking whether the heart was broken. He thought about the answer he'd given her, "I don't know yet," and how that had been the truest answer available at the time. He knew now. The door of the workshop opened and Ford came in first, the way he always did, 7 on the dot, coffee in hand, not requiring any preliminaries before he was useful. He nodded at Ryan, looked at the car, and went to his station. Celeste came in at 7:10, talking on her phone, which she ended as she walked through the door because she had a policy about phones during work hours that she enforced as strictly for herself as for anyone else. She looked at Ryan and then at the car. "You're in early," she said. "Yeah," Ryan said. "Good morning?" she asked. He looked at the car and then at the workshop and then through the window at the industrial street outside where the city was beginning its morning in the particular unremarkable way that cities begin mornings. Traffic building, someone opening a storefront shutter, pigeons moving in the gutter with their specific urban indifference. "Yeah," he said. "It's a good morning." He meant it without qualification, which was not something he could have said on many mornings in the past 4 years. It was not a feeling he trusted to last, because he had too much experience with the way circumstances revised themselves to trust feelings unconditionally. But it was what the morning was, and he wasn't going to argue with it. Vance arrived at 7:15 with a folder of documentation he wanted to discuss. 2 cars were booked in that week. There was work to do, which was the condition Ryan preferred above almost any other. Not because work was the answer to everything, but because having things worth working on, people worth working with, and a reason to get up before anyone else was a particular configuration of life that he'd learned, through the extended process of losing it and rebuilding it, not to take lightly. He got his coffee from the workshop kitchen, a corner of the space he'd set up with a good machine and decent cups, because the only things worth being particular about were the things you returned to every day, and went to his station and opened the folder Vance had brought. Outside, the street continued its morning. The city went about its business. In a school across town, Maya was getting ready for a day that was, by her account as of last night's debrief, looking promising due to the presence of a library period and the absence of the complicated lunch situation. The Aston Martin stood in its corner, catching the light. Ryan worked. Some things don't break. They wait. They wait for someone patient enough to look past the surface, honest enough to trust what they see, and stubborn enough to hold on to a true thing until the world catches up. Ryan Carter was never the story of a man who triumphed over injustice. He was the story of a man who refused to participate in a lie, quietly, without an audience, for 4 years, with a 7-year-old handing him tools she couldn't name. That's less dramatic than a triumph. It's also rarer, and it turns out to be enough.